The young man was running with a phone in his hands. He showed his subscribers a huge beetle. He screamed loudly, trying to be heard above the noise. There was some dark silhouette ahead. The guy covered himself with his hand. He was scared. Someone was holding a phone in their hands and watching a video of this guy who showed a monster beetle. It was not fake. In the audience, students discussed this video. They doubted that it was an insect at all. Such a thing does not happen. The guy sat and looked at the phone. He grinned. It's cool to have such wings. Someone extended his hand to the phone, trying to take it away. The guy looked at the other and did not notice the movement from the side. A young tall guy snatched the phone and stared at it. The young men sitting at the table exclaimed. It was Starks, a student, 20 years old, and he thought that wings were disgusting, and there was nothing beautiful about them. The guy gave me the phone and said that the girls wanted to have a drink and were calling them too. But the others didn't really want to go. They had already gone out for a drink yesterday. A girl jumped on Starks from behind. She was smiling. The guys leaned over and immediately agreed to go. He looked at them and assured them that he was the smartest and most beautiful, speaking with obvious arrogance. He had many subscribers on the social network, excellent grades, parties, and alcohol. This was the life of the young man. If you look at the food chain, the guy was at the top, proudly wearing a royal crown. One might, of course, think that these arguments are too infantile. This thinking stems from the fact that a person, like an insect, lives in a group. All creatures have a compatible way of life. They all have a certain rank, so the ants obey their queen. Starks is an object of envy because people follow him on his heels. He is probably the strongest, so the guy thought about himself. He could never give up such a university life. A guy approached him. He was wondering if he went drinking with other girls. Would it be a problem? Starks was surprised by this. He pointed his finger somewhere, forcing the hero to turn his head and look in that direction. There was a girl there, waving and screaming at Starks, jumping up and down. It was Mia, a girl with pink hair and huge eyes that filled half her face. She smiled and wanted to know where the guy was going. The guys started teasing Starks, calling them the house couple. Mia was offered to go have a drink too. She was embarrassed when she learned that the guy was coming too. After not thinking long about the answer, the girl agreed and ran to Starks. She tried to hug him, but the character turned around and recoiled from her in fear. He turned around sharply, swinging his hand, so that Mia stopped and got scared. Lowering his head and darkening his face, Starks apologized to the guys. They were worried about what was wrong with him. Holding his shoulder, the young man left, telling everyone that he felt bad. The others whispered in his back. The guys were stunned by this behavior. They shouted in the back and did not know how to react. Starks walked and thought about what he had just said. He had run out of excuses and adjusted the strap of his backpack. He had one secret that no one knew about and should not know. Stark saw a guy who used to be cheerful and had many friends, but everything changed and he became a loner. It's all because of complexes. You sit closed in yourself, and shadows surround you. Once that guy drank too much alcohol and developed an allergy, his whole face was covered in blisters. People shied away from him. This is all obvious. I looked at him over my shoulder. He always walks alone now. Every person has something that he would like to hide from strangers. Finally, the guy saw his home. Entering the apartment, Starks began to leave his things. He started talking about this topic only because, taking off his jacket, he experienced pain. Above his abs, his chest was covered with bandages. Snow-white ribbons silently rolled onto the floor. The guy took them off. Having removed all the ribbons, standing in front of the mirror, he looked at himself. Behind him, there were wings on his back. Starks looked at his wings and thought that there was nothing beautiful about them. It was disgusting, and he confirmed his words with a disgusted expression on his face. The reason for all this was that these wings on his back were the wings of a dragonfly. When the guy was still at school, he was in the room spraying dragonflies that flew into the room, when suddenly they all turned into powder. Starks accidentally inhaled. He vomited. He was on his knees and then barely fell asleep. And the next day, when he was brushing his teeth, dropping the brush, he saw wings on his back. He hid from everyone, covering himself with a blanket under the table, a frightened poor boy, thinking that now he was a monster and people would want to experiment on him. His fear was strong. He tried in every way to hide his wings. Always alone, he was able to go to university without anyone knowing about his wings. He was tormented that he was lonely. He pressed his lips together. He wanted to be with his friends. When I entered university, I completely changed my image. He changed his hairstyle, hid his wings, simply bandaged them, and began to show interest in his surroundings. As a result, Starks became more confident in himself. He was called out and touched only for the sake of it. Asking for his name and contact information, the girls began to become interested in him. Starks leaned on the sink, lowered his head. If his wings were seen, his student life would be over. After turning off the water, he wanted to hang out with Mia. These wings are always an obstacle to something. Throwing his hands behind his head, the guy stretched, stretching all his muscles. The fact that he did not straighten his wings for a long time made his whole body go numb. He covered his eyes. He didn't want to be seen, especially by Mia. Starks opened the bathroom door and ran into the girl he had just been thinking about. They looked at each other and didn't believe what they were seeing. The guy pulled away from the door, raised his hand, he screamed very loudly, he was scared. The girl covered her mouth with both hands and rolled her eyes at Starks. The door slammed noisily. Mia turned around sharply and covered her eyes with her hand. The bag rustled in her hands. The guy was without clothes. Starks was behind the door, leaning on her, holding the handle tightly. He asked her how she came in and what she was doing here, and he himself thought about whether she had seen wings, but was afraid to ask directly. It was the guys who offered to have a drink with him and sent Mia out first. In confirmation, she rustled a bag filled with bottles and chips, and the door was open, and she entered. Sweat rolled down the young man's face. He was angry because he had not been informed. A girl's voice was heard, which made the guy look up at the closed door. He really felt bad, or he just left them. She continued to say that it was clear from him that something was hurting him. He always quits them so abruptly. When Mia said about secrecy, Starks blushed very red and pursed his lips. The young man lowered his head, took his hand off the handle. He was not hiding anything like that. Mia lowered her head, blushed. She had nothing to say. She just remained silent and waited. Suddenly, the girl leaned forward sharply and screamed, "Let her come out!" From Mia's unexpected impulse, Starks opened his eyes and stared at the door. The girl sat down on the floor, leaned her back against the wall. She needed the guy to go to the cinema with her today. Otherwise, she would not go anywhere. He was speechless, screamed, and looked out from behind the door. Opening the crack, he looked at Mia until she noticed him. His lie looked too implausible. The girl pulled her knees towards her, hugged them, and talked about how Starks was always alone, as if he had some kind of secret. She put her head on her knees, lowered her head. Tears sparkled in her eyes. She was a little offended and sad. At the beginning of the semester, Mia recalled how Starks saved her from the guy who was following her around. Words flew at the guy from her. At first, she thought that it was selfish, and there was no need to meddle in other people's affairs, however. The girl straightened up and looked at the young man with a smile. Now she is grateful to him. Embarrassed, her eyes sparkled with joy. If he doesn't hate her, then she also wants to meddle in her own business. Starks turned around, pulled the towel off his shoulders. Mia wants to support him. Leaning his back against the door and raising his head up, he mentally thanked the girl. Already dressed, Starks opened the door and went out. He was ready to go to the cinema with a smile, he told her. She looked up at him. The couple went on their way to the cinema. Perhaps this was the right decision. A guy in a hood followed them with his gaze, watching their every movement. Before reaching the cinema, the girl was asked to take part in a survey. Mia ran up happy. Starks hurried her. She was too kind and could not refuse, so we spent some time on this. Mia turned to the young man, showing a lollipop, laughed, and was given candy. Still, we got to the movie, sat next to each other. The girl huddled close to him. Jumping once again, she accidentally spilled a drink on herself, and when she saw this, she hurried to the toilet. Starks watched the retreating girl and thought that if they dated, he would have to talk about his wings. Raising his head up, the guy wondered if she would have a different attitude after what he saw. Continuing to stare at the big screen, Starks could not tell her the whole truth. Let everything take its course for now, the guy decided, and was confident in his decisions. Suddenly, the lights in the hall went out. Everyone began to wonder what had happened and whispered. The man opened the door and shouted that an evacuation was taking place and asked everyone to leave the cinema. There is a suspicious object here, carrying a dangerous weapon. The guy started to sweat. He shouted louder to leave their seats and get out of the building before he could finish his speech. He fell silent, threw his head back unnaturally, and let out a wheeze. Some guy with long, sharp claws instead of hands pierced him as he entered the hall. People began to turn and scream in horror. They jumped up from their seats. The guy who was pierced by the monster's hand asked for help, but no one rushed to him. On the contrary, people scattered around in fear. Starks didn't understand what was happening. He looked at this monster man and sweat ran down his face. He watched the blood running down the legs of the man in the shoes. He couldn't believe his eyes. They killed the guy. People were running away through another entrance. The guy would have escaped too, but Mia wasn't there yet. Then the gaze of this monster settled on Starks, and he said, barely moving his lips, that he had found the one he needed. And he opened his wings and rushed at Starks, who turned around and started running. The monster jumped at him, destroying everything in its path. It had a goal. Starks fell onto his back. He looked at the hands of the one who overtook him and could not believe his eyes. Approaching, the monster salivated and turned to him with the question of what was doing this. Starks saw the insect man in front of him for the first time. He towered over him and was angry. The monster slowly moved towards him. Starks also drank this insect repellent. The guy listened with his mouth open. The medicine was jungle juice. That was the name of this remedy. After he became like this, he leaned even closer and began to smell something. Starks ran headlong. He didn't want to know what that monster would feel if he tried him. Black eyes and a toothy mouth overtook the young man who shouted, "He wants to feel the great taste!" Starks fell to the floor. The insect man was about to attack, but then Mia ran in. The guy leaned on his elbow and looked at the girl. He tried to scream at her, but only a wheeze came out of his throat. She jabbered, explaining that she had left the toilet. An evacuation had been announced, but she could not leave without him. The monster folded its wings, bent over and looked at her, telling her that she was brave. His face darkened. He opened his mouth from which a stream of saliva flowed. He was angry, because at lunchtime someone tried to stop him. Starks screamed at the top of his lungs for Mia to get out of here, trying to get up. At this time, there was a crowd of onlookers in front of the entrance to the cinema. They wanted to get inside, but no one was allowed in. The girl who conducted the survey looked there. If no one goes there, then she needs to go. Suddenly, a girl fell out of a window on the top floor. Everyone screamed, but they didn't know what to do. The insect man threw it out, saying that it was tasteless. Starks got up and rushed to the window. He watched Mia fall. He couldn't let her die, but he had never used his wings to fly. The young man was also worried and afraid that so many people would see him. Mia flew with her arms outstretched and screamed silently, opening and closing her mouth. Her hair clung to her face. Tears rolled from her eyes in large hail. People screamed. Someone started filming. They saw something that excited them. Up there, Starks still couldn't let Mia die. He rushed towards her, holding out his hand. When he caught her, he squeezed her tightly in his arms and tried to work with his wings. The monster watched and grinned, calling the guy thick-headed. Even an insect would die if it fell from such a height. They flew down, and thoughts flew through Starks' head that they would crash and see everything. He clenched his teeth furiously so that a crash was heard. It was still the right decision. Mia saw a bright green glow over her shoulder. It was the guy's wings trying to escape through his clothes. And he went down to the people who looked at it without stopping, carefully holding the girl in their arms. An insect man looked at them from above. He couldn't believe his eyes, and clenched his teeth in an evil grin. Starks descended to the ground with his burden. It seemed to him that he was showing his weak point. The girl in the black cap looked up, wings in the center of the city. She told someone through the earpiece that was in her ear what to do with it, to destroy it. It was better to take him to their school. Taking off his cap, long mustaches appeared on the girl's head. People whispered, "He flies, save the girl," but Starks did not hear this. He flew away with Mia. The monster was angry. He realized that the guy was hiding his wings, so he was also hovering in one place. Starks held Mia in his arms and looked at her. She was bleeding, but there was no response from her. She lost consciousness. This was the young man's first flight. It was unusual for him, but he was already used to it. The man looked at the guy's flight and realization came to him. He remembered who was flying like that, and it was a dragonfly. He stuck out his tongue, licking his lips, looked at Starks' trail and felt hungry again. He wanted a dragonfly. Allowing himself to daydream, the insect man imagined this guy, and his saliva began to flow from his mouth. The girl with the mustache made her way upstairs, hit the monster so that he flew to the floor, and cursed. Apparently he wants to be caught, since he is causing trouble in the city. Having put on and adjusted the cap on her head, she looked at him. The world should not know about their existence. A month has passed, the first semester is ending. Students were talking among themselves in the classroom. We watched the video from the cinema. The guys noticed the similarity of the guy in the video with Starks. The young man then still thought that the rumor would reach the university, and he would be sent for experiments, and adjusted his hood. Some people treated it as fiction, some believed it. The guy remembered how 12 years ago, at his birthday, everyone congratulated him and was happy. They congratulated their beloved Chuck. The girl and the other children laughed, but there was a boy on the side who was not invited. When she tried to say that they should have called this boy too, they replied that they were not very close to him. The children whispered among themselves that he never even brought gifts. He had no money. The boy stood alone. He had neither mom nor dad. This boy was Starks. He stood and looked at them, because even then he just wanted to make friends with them. The boy was different from the others, so he could not rejoice at such happiness. Starks walked alone. His thoughts were busy wondering why he was like this, and did not notice how someone approached him. This someone grabbed his long jacket with his hand. The guy froze. His eyes widened. Turning sharply, he swung his hand, hitting some guy who was touching him. The guy tried to justify himself that he was sent to check if he had wings. The reaction scared him. Gritting his teeth, adjusting his hood, he looked at the laughing guys. He was offended, because a month ago they were friends and went to university together. Starks felt lonely again. It would be better if he was tested. All the students looked at him and whispered. Sitting on the bus, he checked his social networks. Many people had unfollowed him, but there was also Mia. People were scared of strange things, but he hoped that the girl would be friends with him. He remembered her smiling face, wide eyes, how she waved her hand to him. Just today, Starks found out that Mia had woken up, looked at the phone, and smiled. A large multi-story building appeared with a hospital sign on top. Mia screamed and crawled towards the head of the bed, fear taking over her. Starks entered the room, smiled. He did not understand what caused such a reaction in the girl. He rushed towards the girl, shouting that it was him. But the nurses held him and tried to push him out of the room. The guy reached out to Mia, extended his hand to her, but the women held him tightly, shouting that there was no place for him here. The girl's face darkened. She stammered and said not to come close to her anymore, and she shrank all over. When the word monster flew at his back, he turned pale, left the room, and could not believe what he heard. Already in the apartment, the things he had thrown were lying. The light was on in the bathroom. Starks stood in front of the mirror, scratching his shoulder with his hand. It was all because of those wings. The guy took the towel in his teeth and brought the scissors to the wings. He needs to cut them and everything will be fine. The scissors touched his wing. Just a little effort and everything would be over. Dropping the scissors on the floor, they fell with a thud, and a drop of water fell on the foot. Starks sat on his knees on the bathroom floor, his whole body trembling. Tears flowed from his eyes onto the floor and onto his feet. He was weak, blaming himself for cowardice. Such people who spend a lot of time alone have only one option. When people seem to be around you but no one needs you, those who were your friends before quickly found a replacement for you. In front of the guy, there was a staircase that led up to the roof. Starks stood on the edge of the roof and looked down. Out of loneliness, there was only one exit, and this exit was in front of him. He looked down with a tired, sad look down to where the people were. Balancing on one leg, he planned to fall, and finally stepped forward. He flew several floors, his wings opened, the young man drooped, he couldn't even die. He felt worthless, even death passed him by. The girl in the cap looked at Stark's wings in admiration. She exhaled. Seeing the girl, the guy looked at her in fear. How long had she been here? She straightened her cap and smiled, and Starks thought about how it stayed on the wall. If he doesn't like his wings that much, then she didn't finish her speech, took off her cap, and the guy saw long mustaches on his head. Her eyes sparkled red. There was a way to become human. She could share it. Starks cried out. He was surprised that there was a way to become human. He looked at her. She was the same as him. The girl offered to go inside and talk. Inside, the guy sharply pressed the girl against the wall and demanded an explanation. She folded her arms over her chest and stared at him. The girl laughed. She didn't know how to become human again. Starks swore at her. Having returned the cap to its place, she had a condition. Go for an interview at their university, and the professor will explain everything himself. Opening his mouth, Starks asked again several times as if he had not heard the first time. There is a ring bus waiting on the ground floor. If the guy follows her, he can meet him. She went down a flight lower. Starks doubted whether he should trust her, because one mantis had already almost eaten him. If he trusts her, he will no longer be lonely. Pictures of how he was offended surfaced in his memory. The bus carried them along the road anyway. While he had nothing to do, he couldn't trust her. Already in their seats on the bus, the girl showed Starks a bottle of the same insect repellent. She wanted to ask him if he knew what it was. He stared at this can, his eyes widened. He recognized it. The girl looked at him from under her cap. This is jungle juice, a product that mixed human and insect DNA. It was very popular because of its effect. But there was a problem when an insect was killed. Its DNA entered the human body. Therefore, part of your body became, like that of that praying mantis, from an insect. Starks clenched his hand into a fist and hit his leg. He wanted to know who invented this remedy, but the girl herself didn't know. Neither the person nor the company who invented it is known, but a large number of people became infected from it. They continued to drive and chat. The guy bit his lip and grabbed the phone. He was looking for something about this product, but there was nothing. The girl also looked at the phone. Without turning her head, she gave it up. They hushed everything up. A surprised glance glanced at her, but they had already arrived, so they had to go out. She did not wait for the young man and got off the bus. He hurried after him but slowed down at the exit. Starks looked around. Weren't they still in the tunnel? But the girl had already gone upstairs. She started pressing something on the wall while asking where the tunnels were. The guy didn't know. The light has illuminated them. They are hiding from people, constantly hiding. What the young man saw surprised him. He opened his eyes and opened his mouth. Their campus was located in the forest, large buildings, as if in a cocoon, which is why it was called the nest. Starks walked in a hurry ahead. He looked around. was surprised that the town was located inside the mountain. He saw a lot of people. They were all different. This place seemed like a jungle to the guy. He couldn't believe that there were so many people like him. There was an opportunity to become human. A man in chains was watching them from a large window, the same one who attacked in the cinema. He remembered that it was a dragonfly, but the guards did not allow him to look longer, pushing him in the back and hurrying him. The guards laughed at him. Now he would be a guinea pig, and he was electrocuted. In pain, he clenched his teeth tightly so that crumbs fell. This man blamed the dragonfly for everything. Starks looked up as the girls flew over him, curious what this place was all about. He looked around, clenched his fist to see if all the insects were here, and with his mouth open, he spun around on its axis. The girl with a barely noticeable smile confirmed his words. Everyone here suffered from this remedy. This place is called a university. She looked towards the cafe where people were drinking drinks and eating. In fact, this place is only an opportunity to protect such people. She told him he won't be alone here. Starks looked at her dumbfounded. She will be back soon. She needs to report to the department while she can take a walk. Look around. He is a new student this semester. Welcome to the nest, she said, and ran away, leaving Starks standing in the middle of the road. It's hard to imagine that such a fantastic university is located here. Starks looked at the people and thought that they also had insect parts and didn't even hide them. His gaze was attracted by an insect that was buzzing and flying somewhere to the side. Having followed him, the guy looked at a man who was sitting in a yoga pose in an arch. He was covered in honey and covered in insects. He said that he gives them honey, and in exchange they provide him with protein, and raised one of the beetles with his hand. Such is the circle of life. He raised his hand with the beetle to his mouth, intending to eat it. Starks grimaced when he heard the crunch. He was very surprised that a bug had been eaten. Starks put his hands in his jacket pocket and walked forward along the path. He realized that there were no normal people here. The crunch of eating bugs could be heard behind him. Suddenly he was pulled by his jacket. The voice of that man asked what kind of beetle he was, and from pulling his jacket, wings appeared. The guy suddenly broke free, flying away from the man. He was dissatisfied with this action. The man put his hand to his cheek and praised the wings, saying they were in great shape, flexible. Starks was breathing heavily. He was all red and wet. His eyes were open. He heard a question from him. Why hide such good wings? After this question, the guy narrowed his eyes and remembered how Mia reacted to him in the hospital. He turned around and walked angrily along the path. He was here to get rid of them. The man followed the young man with a long, thoughtful look. He called him a pathetic fool. At the pulpit, Stark saw a man with dark hair. He extended his hand. It was Professor Max Farron. It's good that Kayla Crom brought him. He heard about him from reports. Starks stared at the man. He couldn't believe it was a professor. Coming closer and shaking hands, he must know the way to become human, the guy thought. Then you should get straight to the point, said the professor, took the remote control in his hand, and pressed power. Turning around, the man said that he would tell everyone how to become a human. But first let him watch the video. Starks stared at the screen. It was a video from their university graduation. The three of them stood in front of the large screen and watched as first the class representative gave the graduation speech, then the top students. Next in the video, they begin to award Cinderella, who received his diploma from the hands of the professor. The guy stared wide-eyed at the screen. Who is it? His whole head is like a beetle. Starks saw a glass of something in his hands. Alcohol, he exclaimed in surprise. Having just taken a sip from the glass, he feels bad. He bent over, dropped the glass on the floor, and it broke. The young man watched the actions intently and gritted his teeth. Gradually, a girl appeared from that insect. She transformed. Starks began to scream, pointing at the screen with his hand, where the video stopped at the moment as tears fell from the girl's eyes. The accidentally obtained remedy was removed by university scientists. Max showed a bottle called Cinderella, which will help turn insect people into ordinary people. The guy was stunned. This remedy can restore human appearance. He shouted loudly. He needed this medicine. He put his hand to his chest, but the professor would not give this medicine. Lowering his eyes, Max began his speech about how difficult this medicine is to prepare. Biting his lip, the guy listened to the idea of returning everyone to normal life, but only if he wanted it so badly. Then you just need to enter this university and graduate with the best results, like the girl in the video. Max looked at him. They only give the medicine to the best students, like in the video he just watched. Starks was dumbfounded. He had no words. He had to study again, but for the sake of medicine this time. They left the audience. The guy thoughtfully rubbed his chin. Kayla asked him what he would do, but the guy had no choice. The girl turned to him. The choice will always be yours. You can stay here and live. Even if he enrolls, it is not a fact that he will become the best student. But Starks thought it was good that money was not the issue. Having put on his glasses, he was confident in himself. He could transfer to you right now. On the way to the classroom, Starks listened to students talk about choosing professors, about how they need to approach this more seriously so as not to fail classes. The guy was transferred very quickly, and now he stood in the middle of everyone, and it seemed as if this was really a university. The young man remembered Kayla. She helped him a lot. At first he was confused, did not know which course to choose. The girl handed him a notebook where the main courses were written down. When enrolling, you can choose one of them. Starks opened the notebook and began to leaf through it carefully, looking serious as he read. Among them was the Nest Defense course, taught by Professor Max. The guy remembered this man. Slamming the notebook shut, he looked over it. Great, he'll sign up for his course. However, he looked at the building. They need to get ready and take the entrance exams. Usually they just use the computer cafe. The guys sat in front of the monitors. Are the computers at this university really that good? Starks thought, leafing through his notebook. A girl and a guy flew past him. She held him by the throat with one hand and swung at him with the other. The hero looked in their direction, took his eyes off the notebook and opened his mouth in surprise. He looked at the fight. Students were already running up to them from all sides. The girl was beating the guy without paying attention to anyone. The girl struck with a smile, saying at the same time that she warned him not to be at the university. They started a fight out of nowhere, and the guy responded by trying to shout to her. To come to the university and get into a fight, Starks was indignant. These are the hostages he heard about. You will often have to see this, don't be afraid, Kayla said as she passed the guy. The girl approached the guy and the girl and scattered them in different directions. The guy opened his mouth from what happened before his eyes. These antennas on the girl's head helped calm these two down. The beaten guy tried to get up. He was lying on the ground. He would like to know who this girl is. You start the new semester with a fight. Apparently you have a lot of energy, he heard raising his head. Kayla was a department representative. Starks had just found out about it. He was in the same department with someone like her, looked at the girl. She turned, waved her hand at him, and sent him to the entrance exams. She herself remained with the fighters. Starks made it. He arrived on time, took a seat at the laptop, and began to wait. His student life was shattered when the same guy and girl sat down behind him, and Kayla sat down a little further. But for Starks, it's more important now to pass the entrance exams. Turning to his laptop, he focused on his work. The guy has a goal. He must get to the department of Professor Max. At this time, this same professor was thinking intently about his own business when he was approached. Nest came in, taking the towel off his shoulders. It was a freelance professor. He already knew about the new student. The men stood opposite each other. Max would like to hear an opinion about this newcomer, about Starks. The man rubbed his beard with his hand and thought he doubted that he would pass the exams. Starks looked at the screen. He was terrified. Sweat was forming on his forehead and his hands were shaking. The entrance exam began. Everyone around began to flicker about doing something, running somewhere. Our hero also jumped up, turned his head, but still didn't understand where everyone was running, because the opening ceremony had begun. Looking out the open window, he began to guess, but refused to believe it. Starks ran to the window, intending to follow the others, but hesitated. But everyone else was already flying. They knew what they needed. Only the strongest could become university students. Leaning out of the window, Starks did not understand where everyone had flown and what was happening. Someone asked him about the fact that he did not have time to listen to the explanation for the exam. The guy turned towards the voice. The young man saw the little b-boy. He wanted to explain to him what needed to be done, if of course he didn't mind. They need to find the professor, Starks exclaimed. Here in this place, they just need to find a man. They walked along a forest path. In order to be enrolled in the class, you need to find the professor in the forest, the boy answered. A man will give a flash drive only when the flash drive is inserted into the computer in the classroom. Then you will be a student. Starks shouted, they don't have time to chat? But the b-boy interrupted him. He had already decided which faculty he wanted to go to. Having calmed down for a moment, the guy scratched his head, looked back at him. He knew that Professor Max gives the best grades. The boy looked smiling. He was clearly embarrassed. What Starks wants is hard to achieve, but he is impressed. Having said goodbye to each other, we went in different directions. The guy thought that he was a good guy. The guy was thinking. A lot of time had passed, whether he was too late in his search. Starks walked and scratched his head. He wanted to know where the others were, in which direction they had gone. He needed higher ground. He bent down cautiously, looked around. His wings made themselves felt. He took off his jacket. She hung on the branch of a tree. Everyone froze in anticipation. And the guy flew up. His wings raised higher and higher. The forest became small. When he was already high, he opened one eye. He could see everything perfectly, even where the others flew. Taking a closer look, Stark saw flags that were fluttering in the wind. They needed to be followed. They showed the way. He saw not only flags, but also a fight. The guys were fighting among themselves. The young man was surprised that they were all fighting each other. There was a question in his eyes. Curses could be heard from the floating guy. Apparently, this was due to the entrance exams. But the battle in front of him was so intense that Starks wondered if the lectures were worth it. I thought that it would be better for him to get out of here and turn to the flags. After all, there was hope in them. What flag does Professor Max have? Starks decided to rely on luck. Braking himself, he nevertheless flew towards the first flag, hoping that he would be lucky. At point A, a man was sitting in a large clearing. His legs crossed. He was waiting. It was Professor Max. He was drinking tea from a cup and reading a book. But he looked up from it, looked into the distance and chuckled. A guy landed at his feet. He rolled his belly along the ground, arms outstretched. It was Starks. Raising his head, he smiled. His guess was correct, although the landing was not very successful. But since there are many people who want a good professor, many people were arriving at this point, the young man rose from the ground. The man looked at him, and the guy was glad that he was able to use all the advantages of his insect. The professor opened the case. There was one flashcard, and he gave it to Starks. He held a flash drive in his hand, looked at it, and was embarrassed. He barely had time to see that it was the only one in his hand. Now we need to go back to the classroom and insert it into the computer, the professor sent the guy, telling him to be careful. Starks was already praising himself ahead of time. He took the first step, holding a flash drive in his hand. Walking back happy, the man announced to the others that there were no more places. Professor Max had something in his hands, so when he handed over all the flash drives, he decided it was time to start. Starks heard a sound. Someone was texting. He turned around to see what was there. Looking at his phone, he saw photos of several people, including himself. His eyes widened. They were the target. The guy didn't know what that meant. Next was lying in a hammock and laughing. That student received a flash drive. Kayla also looked at the phone. She saw that Starks received Professor Max's flash drive. Everyone started looking at their phones. Now the fun begins. Our hero gritted his teeth and looked at the phone. The realization dawned on him that the exam was not over yet. He looked around. Everything now seemed suspicious to him. It was scary. He managed to bend down and cover his head with his hands when the guy slashed something from above. It was a long-horned beetle, so strong that it could break any tree. Starks tried to get away from him, turning around and trying to reach the guy. On the way, he came across a flagellated spider with ropes growing from its back. They all wanted to get a flash drive. Starks dodged when he heard about the flash drive. He got angry. He wasn't going to give anything away. He started to run away, but they all rushed after him. More and more people were added in this pursuit. The young man sped up. He wondered why this exam sucked so much. Starks heard someone calling him. He turned around and clenched his fist. A bee-boy was sticking out of a tree. He was calling him to hurry up. The insect people ran past. It seemed to them that he had run away in that direction. Hidden inside the tree, they were breathing heavily and trembling. Closing his eyes, Starks thanked him for the help. Once again, he helped him. A good guy. The boy held his head, embarrassed that he was saying such a thing. It was strange for him to hear a kind word. The boy came closer, raised his finger and pierced Starks' forehead with a thin rod. The guy raised his head up, his whole body went numb, his fists remained clenched. Since the young man's body did not move, the boy calmly unclenched his fist and took out a flash drive. The boy squeezed the hand with the prey. He released the poison of the honeybee, and for some time he would not be able to move. The boy mocked Starks. Being a good-natured guy is quite funny, he grinned. Bringing his face closer to the hero's face, he said that everyone here is rivals and no one will help. Starks began to sweat. He gritted his teeth, becoming the strongest as an exam. The smug boy tossed over his shoulder to try harder next year. When he went upstairs, he said that a character like that would never become the best. He won't be any better if he steals his flash drive, Starks thought, and pulled his hand to his forehead to pull out the rod. With a shiver through his body and drops of sweat, he stands up, picking up the rod from the floor. He needs to get Cinderella. With all his anger, the guy flies out after him. He needs to become a normal person. When the boy saw Starks, he was surprised. This was an example of the removal of all restrictions. He flew pleased with himself and laughed at the hero, the slow speed of which depended on his poison. Starks extended his hand in his direction. He should catch up with the boy, but he was getting further and further away. One thought was beating in the hero's head that he needed to catch up with him, and suddenly the guy's eyes lit up green. Starks videoed the boy's movements. He already knew every subsequent action. The dragonfly, called the Queen of the Hunt, has a great success rate. The secret lies in her eyes. They are unique. They capture the slightest change in movement. Thanks to their amazing eyes, dragonflies read the movements of their prey. At that moment when Starks thought, "I want to catch up," the kid became a victim. The boy saw the guy out of the corner of his eye and realized that he had the ability of a dragonfly. Having caught up, the hero punched him in the jaw, forcing him to fly further. Someone's hand inserted another flash drive into the slot, and a squeak was heard about enrollment. Kayla looked at the laptop. How many were still enrolled, and exhaled. The guy who took part in the fight looked at her. He was interested in the boy he met today. There are many people who want to get to Professor Max, especially if he doesn't have time and won't be automatically enrolled. The girl rested her cheek on her fist and thought about this new thing. The flash drive fell out of the little clawed hand of the B-boy. Starks looked down. She flew far away. How could she have been carried so far? The guy rushed down with all his speed to get his flash drive, covering one eye and holding out his hand. He reached out his hand, but before he could grab it, someone's hand clutched the flash drive in a fist. He was ahead of him by a girl who smiled and thanked him for the gift. Starks was confused. His flash drive was taken right from under his nose. The girl was already far away. He screamed and clenched his fists. He was going to catch up with her and had not yet decided what he would do with her. But when he saw the boy, and that he was falling from a height, he thought, because he might break. The hero couldn't believe that he was knocked out with one blow and was now flying down without regaining consciousness. Looking at the flash drive, he might miss it, the guy lamented. Starks was torn, and he blamed the boy. He was the first to start, and he felt sorry for him. The little bee's head was already close to the ground, but he brought this upon himself. He didn't let him touch the bottom, but still pulled himself towards himself and flew with the boy. Starks couldn't pretend he didn't see anything and looked down. As a person, he could not allow this to happen and flew with the boy. The little bee ended up on the tree, alive, and a crow sat next to him and looked at him with one eye. Starks flew down. He was done for. He missed the thief and was very upset. All wet and tired, he didn't know what to do. He needed to get another flash drive. Exhausted, he flew into a tree branch and fell down. He fell face down, trying to get up. The guy didn't understand what was wrong with his body. The effect of the poison was still lasting. Trembling ran through his whole body. Sweat rolled down like hail. He would not die, but he would fall into such a sad state because of the exam. The character's eyes were closing. His thoughts were confused. He needed to concentrate, but he couldn't. Next approached him, chewing cookies, and turned to the lying boy, ordering him to get up. Starks leaned on his hands, stood up, opened his mouth, worried that he had been passed out for a long time and he was late. Seeing who was in front of him, a picture popped up in his memory where this guy was covered in honey and eating bugs. Next walked forward along the path and told him over his shoulder that he needed to go already. He had been lying down enough. Stark stood up, squatted. The entrance exam was over. The young man's face darkened. The man looked at his watch, or rather there were 5 minutes left before the end. Probably there were no flash drives anymore. Let him try next year, but the medicine might run out. The hero started screaming about cheating, waving his arms, saying that his flash drive was stolen. The man looked over his shoulder at him with anger and swore at him after they took him away. Starks looked angry, but he will not be allowed to retake the test. There is no such thing at the university. The main thing here is to be strong. If you have a goal, you need to move towards it. In addition, the professors are watching everything. They will not allow anything to happen to the students. Jungle juice turns people into weapons. All these horns, tails, claws are very dangerous. The man squeezed the cookie package with force. They don't sit and read books in class. If this is what you want, then you should go to the Civil Defense Center of the Nest. If you stay there, you will live the life of a beetle man in peace and quiet. Next toss the crumpled packaging to Starks. He's still here with nothing to do. With a thumbs up and a smile, take care of nature and sort your garbage. The professor left, leaving the guy alone in the middle of the forest. He stood and did not understand what to do next. He lowered his head. He was sad that in the end he didn't get anywhere. He raised his hand with the trash and poked it in his face. Angry at himself, he considered himself trash. After a while, Starks raised his hand and remembered the man's words about sorting garbage. The young man was angry. He was already upset. He also received assignments. He looked at the bag in his hand. He stared at something in his hand. His eyes widened. He looked and did not believe. Having opened the bag, holding it with both hands, he saw a flash drive that lay at the bottom of the bag. I couldn't believe my eyes. I remembered the professor's words that not a single flash drive should be left, and there was little time left. Starks looked to where the audience was. There was little time left. Professor Max walked through the forest. Seeing Professor Next, he asked how he was doing. Max was surprised that he gave the flash drive to the guy because he didn't like him. He even expressed the idea that the professor was pursuing some goal. Professor Next just wanted a whipping boy. This boy was already running headlong into the classroom. The guy was flying, but he couldn't keep up. He didn't have time. Starks stopped abruptly, leaving a brake mark, he remembered. He took out a spectacle case with glasses. This is the solution. He will try this, hoping that it will help him. The delighted young man put on glasses, so dust and wind would get less into his eyes. He can increase his speed. He rushed into the audience. Several people were sitting near the university at the beginning of the forest. They wanted to wait here for those who had flash drives and take them away. Running through the forest was not for them. Some guy was running towards them. People were happy. Their wait paid off. They prepared to attack him, stuck out their long tongues and extended their claws. And the group rushed forward, but they slowed down, not understanding what was happening. The one they were hunting for was too fast. They didn't succeed, and they decided to take the flash drive from the classroom, even though it was against the rules. They all knew this, so the guy who started it all tripped them up and the couple fell to the ground. The guy was lying on the ground and his tears were flowing. He shouted, "Who did this?" A girl, a first-year student, put her foot on this guy. She reminded him that fighting in the classroom is prohibited. Kayla received a text message from the professor saying that the newcomer needed help. The girl smiled. She wondered what the new guy had done that even the professor was worried about him. Starks flew through the window, all sweaty. He was struggling to the end with all his strength. The treasured laptop was on fire. All he had to do was install a flash drive. Inserting the flash drive, biting his lip, the guy stared at the screen and quickly typed something. Having filled out what was needed, Starks raised his finger and froze. He was enrolled in a course in practical bug control. He leaned back in his chair. The guy exhaled exhaustedly. This is not the course he wanted, but this is not the time to be picky. If he tries to study, then he still has a chance to become a better student. But something caught Starks' attention, and he approached the screen. He jumped up from his seat after completing the entrance exam. The guy was peering at the screen. The young man received notification of the start of the course. He went to the main auditorium. Was this crazy day not over yet, Starks thought? He was led by the arms, squeezing him tightly so that he would not run away, by 2 guards. They put him out. No outsiders were allowed in. Only professors and students could enter. Starks began to argue with them that he was also a student, but he did not have a pass. The guy looked at them. He didn't know where he could get it to get through. Someone's hand showed a pass with a photo of the young man and said that this is the pass. It was Kayla. She brought his pass, looked at him embarrassedly, smiled, and straightened a lock of hair. They walked along the corridor. Starks was embarrassed. He put his hand behind his head, asking the girl where she was going. Now it will be more difficult to become the best student. But the guy did not lose hope of becoming the best in the course of the stern teacher. Hanging the pass around his neck, Starks was not going to give up. He answered Kayla with a smile. She looked over her shoulder at him and saw the guy examining his pass with a smile. The girl looked surprised. He is a brave guy. She smiled either at her thoughts or at the guy. They approached the lecture hall. Stark's classes were about to begin. Entering the hall, the guy heard people screaming there, pointing their fingers at him. Guys and girls stared at him, opened their mouths. They all recognized him as the guy from the cinema. Starks pulled back. He was afraid of such a reaction from others. The conversations did not stop. Someone hit the table hard with their fist, silencing everyone in the audience. The guy pointed his finger at Starks and began to reprimand him for simply spreading his wings in front of people. He silently listened to the fact that they were able to settle everything, and it was quite difficult. Opening his mouth, the young man remembered Kayla's words. A drop of sweat ran down his cheek, because everything quickly calmed down. The girl hit the speaker on the head with the book, and Starks realized that they had been protecting him from the very beginning. Kayla winked at him. Don't pay attention because you only did it to save the girl. Everyone who was in the hall began to smile and wink. They all know it. Kayla stood up and put her hands on her hips. She would have done the same. Starks stared wide-eyed at them. The girl replied that he could be proud. The guy watched Kayla leave and thought that this girl was too kind. He was being watched by some guy who had his legs folded on the table. The guy yelling at him folded his arms and stared at Starks. Kayla was nice to him because he was new. But he fell silent because the guy poked his head into the table with his hand, bent down and whispered something. Starks opened his mouth at such a picture and screamed. That guy greeted everyone. That guy stretched out, attracting everyone's attention. He wanted to say something when everyone gathered, but then he would have to sit in his place. He made a request to the others, looking at the guy lying face down on the desk. Insect people with bats and sticks began to enter the lecture hall, and their chief ended his speech by asking to give way to the best student. He grinned. The rest didn't like it, so just ask, what else is this? He appeared behind the couple unexpectedly. He just wants this medicine, and they will help him get it. He touched the antenna on the girl's head while removing her pass, so he would be the only one attending lectures. The guy laughed evilly, pleased with himself. The rest were seized by panic. Starks looked at all this. Starks turned all red, clenched his hand into a fist, and shouted to the whole audience that this was nonsense. He ran, waving his fist to hit, shouting that no one would take his student identity. The guy grinned at the flying bug, which ran straight into his hands. He said like a baseball and leaned back, and the guy put out a bat, which our hero stumbled upon. It was very difficult for Starks to come to his senses. He had a headache and there was a wound on his forehead. He opened one eye and exhaled. He squeezed his eyes shut in pain, the bandage on his head turning red. Having risen, the guy looked around, seeing Kayla. He wanted to know where he was. The girl gave the answer, in the first aid post. The girl began her story that after finishing her business, she returned to the hall and found you two unconscious and sent you here. Screaming loudly, Starks felt himself looking for his pass, but it was not there. They had taken it. Kayla leaned against the door. You can get a new one, don't worry. The young man exhaled with joy. The girl would go get him and get new ones. She turned around in the doorway, let him rest, and looked at the guy. Starks looked at her. She is so sweet and kind. She is suitable to be a representative of the department. But then the young man remembered Mia, who was also sweet and good. He was distracted from his memories by a voice from the next room. The guy looked at him in surprise. This was the guy who started a fight near the university. He looked alarmed that something had happened. Starks told everything. It was unpleasant to lose his students. The guy waved his hand at this, saying that the department representative had gone to get new ones. He jumped out of bed, gritted his teeth, swore he couldn't trust her. It was not clear why others could not attend lectures. They could simply remove those who represented competition. The guy asked Starks one question. How many students could be released per day? He sat on the bed in a stupor. Realization came to him. His eyes flew open. A bead of sweat rolled down. She went to meet those guys at night. Near the river they had a meeting. The girl looked at them from under the cap. She asked, just in case, if they wanted to voluntarily return the passes. The guy was holding student cards in his hands. They were not going to return them. He cursed and attacked her. He grinned and looked at the girl. His plan worked. He didn't need passes. From the very beginning, they planned to lure her here. One approached from behind with a bat. Kayla was the best student of the first semester. She prepared for the attack. The guys were creeping up, swinging their bats and spreading their claws. The head looked at his minions, grimaced. They couldn't cope with the girl on the ground. Attracting her attention, he took off his student ones and put his hand above the water, shouting to her that he would throw them away. Kayla put out her hand and rushed to intercept him, but it didn't work. Trying to strike, she entered him. Everyone screamed, her eyes widened. The girl ended up on his territory, because he is the strongest predator among aquatic insects. Kayla screamed. The water overwhelmed her. She was all wet and could not do anything. And the guy didn't waste any time. He began to attack her, pointing his claws in her direction. Without her, becoming the best student is as easy as shelling pears. But if you kill her on campus, it will be suspicious. But if she drowns, no one will suspect anything. Hands on Kayla's neck, she opened her mouth in an attempt to gasp for air, but only took in water. With a satisfied smile, the guy squeezed his hands. He liked the girl's torment. The rest of the young men laughed. They wanted to mock her so that she would ask for death. It would be great if he played around before killing. He came here for that anyway. The guys stood and looked at each other. They did not understand who had just run through here. Emerging from under the water, Kayla took a deep breath and screamed. She stared to the side in shock, her mouth open, water dripping down her face. Starks clenched his fists and beat the guy. He was angry and swore at him. The leader's gang looked at the guy in surprise. They didn't know who he was. They realized that it was the one flying from the class, cursed, but did nothing yet. The guy grinned. He could stand after his blow. He was curious about this insect. He landed his blow. Stark's eyes widened. The attack was strong. The blow hit the guy in the chest. He was thrown back. The predator rejoiced. But Starks, like last time, saw all his movements. His eyes turned green. The guy's vision revealed all his actions. He's not that fast, so you can even answer. The young man heard Kayla scream loudly, calling him to leave from there. Starks did not see how behind him the sharp claw growing from that man's hand would now touch his back. The hero obeyed the girl and recoiled from him, flying away. Starks turned to the girl. He had everything going for him. But she screamed at him that this predator was no match for everyone else, and they were not in an advantageous position. The beetle that lives in this guy is a swimming beetle. He is the most dangerous on the water. The guy listened and hovered over the water. If he falls under the water, it's the end. He needs to get to the shore. The predator mocked the couple. He showed them their passes and laughingly asked if they were leaving. Everyone gathered behind him. They smiled and waited for their actions. Starks grinned, cunning, outnumbered, and they also want to fight where it is convenient for them. He told the girl to leave. Kayla asked not to get involved in this fight, but she herself was preparing for an attack. Their goal is the best student. If they get it, they will give away student money. Zipping a turtleneck under the neck is just her problem. The guy did not listen, flew closer to the girl and returned her words to her. He smiled and looked openly at Kayla. She was not alone. He would try his best. Starks went down to her, stood next to her and pointed his finger. By the way, they say he remembered. He didn't come alone. The one who was in the first aid post stood behind the guys. With quick movements, he deftly scattered this gang in different directions. This was the Locust, who uses his legs in battle. They have spikes on them, and he is here to get his student back. The man looked at Locust Sonic, the second person he would like to deal with after the representative. He dodged Stark's attempt to snatch the passes and laughed at this pathetic insect. Having thrown the hero away with one blow, he was discouraged that he even dared to approach him. But the character laughed in response. Who made the mistake here was his response to the bewildered face of the predator. All the dragonfly needed was to avoid being hit by this man. Gritting his teeth, the predator thought that the guy was not moving in a straight line as before. He now had room to maneuver, and he wondered what kind of beetle he was, how he flies skillfully and feels free on the water. Starks tried to pick up his student money again, but he didn't succeed. The young man tried to calculate his strength. If he used speed and kinetic force, he would be able to strike. And he doesn't care what the difference in strength is between them. He clenched his teeth and thought, this should be enough to strike. Head thrown back, blood, that's what the guy wants. The blow was delivered. The predator's head was thrown back, but because of the water, the damage was reduced by half. Rubbing his face with his hand, the man stood up. He slowed down the attack, saying that they had no reason to do this. He squinted his eyes to the side, saw Kayla, and asked him to solve everything with words. Sonic lamented that he got a riffraff. He sat and looked at the guys at his feet. While the predator was distracting, something was gurgling behind the girl under the water. A guy jumped out from under the water, grabbed Kayla, and shouted to Kaneem that he had her. But the department representative repelled his grab and hit him with her elbow, so the guy flew off. Hennem was angry. He needed to kill this girl. She turned to him in fear. Starks grabbed the predator's claw hands from above, holding him back. He pulled it out. The guy shouted that he was no longer in the water. Kaneem's eyes became bloodshot. Starks dragged him and shouted he was now not on his territory. This is his property now, and he can do whatever he wants here. He threw Kaneem to the ground. He screamed, hitting the ground so hard that saliva flowed out of his mouth, no matter how much he wanted the medicine. His methods are inhumane. He took away student passes and clenched them in his fist. Starks told him that he didn't need to become a human if he couldn't be a good bug. Having done all his business, the hero flew on, and Kayla stood in the water and looked at him. The girl put her hand to her chest. She did not take her eyes off the retreating figure. They returned to the classroom after dark. The introductory lecture was over. They returned the student passes, but did not say that it was their fault. They stood in the aisle and watched as the passes were sorted out. In fact, Kayla asked not to tell anyone because she blamed herself. Starks put his hand to his forehead and smiled. Although he didn't make it to the lecture, he wasn't alone in this. The hero got his own house, brought his boxes into the room, and inspected everything. He is far from his home, but the hostel is not that bad, the guy decided, examining his uniform. During this activity, the character did not notice how someone appeared behind him and put a hand on his shoulder. It was Locust behind his back. He praised him for how he behaved on the lake, and it turned out that the new roommate was him, Sonic. He sat down on the floor, he put his arm around his shoulders and chatted about various things, and offered him a drink. He craned his head and looked who was entering their room. Their door was not locked. The girls entered the room, carrying with them a bag of alcohol and a box of beer. They were delighted at the spacious room. They came to celebrate the beginning of the semester, and since Starks lives with Sonic, they will drink too. A girl leaned over to him and asked if he would drink with them. The moon rose above the campus. The lights came on in the windows, and the rooms took on a life of their own. Starks drank. He hadn't drunk in so long since he showed his wings. He was having fun with his new friends, flushed, and drank a drink from a glass. Somewhere in the forest, Hennem made excuses for not being able to kill the student, but his goal was to attract attention. Listening to his speech was a girl who was sitting on a tree with her legs crossed. Her head was full of insects, but those who did not complete the task were eliminated. Hennem shouted, "Next time he will do everything better and get Cinderella." The girl did not know what it was. At this, her insect's eyes lit up red, and she resolutely said that they had no need for such a thing. The girl flew up and soared above the guy. He stood like an idol and could not move, only opened his eyes wide. She walked away from Hennem, who was lying in blood, muttering that such a strong one could not cope with the newcomer. With a bloody hand, she straightened her head, grinned. The head will be pleased. The next day there were students in the classroom. It was light and spacious. Starks was nervous. His hands were clenched into fists. Today was the first lecture. He was interested in what they would teach. The person sitting next to him poked his fist with his finger and advised him not to shake like that. Kayla was at the same table with him. She replied that there would be only one small test. Hearing that the girl would help him, the guy was embarrassed, blushed, and was once again convinced that she was kind. Professor next walked around the audience. attracting attention to himself. Today there will be a test, as discussed yesterday. Grasping the saw with a strong hand, the professor replied that the grade will be reflected in the result. Looking at the class, he immediately warned that they could die. Starks put on a smile on his face, but sweat was pouring down his face. He was scared. They walked out to the training ground outside the nest. Starks was sweating, scared. He didn't understand the whole situation. They all ran away from the instantly enraged professor, who ran after them and brandished a saw. Professor next, with red eyes, held a large saw in his hands. He ran after the students, not lagging behind them. Sonek got ahead of the hero and shouted to him as he ran that this was their curator. Kayla ran up too. She said that this was the practical part, looking back. Their role is to fight guys like that who almost ate you. Starks remembered that praying mantis. The man with the saw said this at the introductory lecture, but they didn't show up. The professor stopped. There are those who use insect weapons for harm, the man continued, so we need to find them all. Starks looked at him, grimaced. If they want Cinderella, then let them move. Only the strongest will survive. The first test is a game of hare. You need to hide from him as quickly as possible, otherwise he will find you. The beard was scattered in the wind. The professor was serious. Sonek and Starks opened their mouths at what they heard. They could fly out and no longer become the best students. The test starts right now, he said, started up his saw and rushed at the guys. The young man deftly dodged the saw. He was confused that he needed to run and learn something. A memory surfaced in his mind that when he met the praying mantis, he simply ran away. Sonek also dodged. He was indignant because the old man was too fast. The guy cursed when he saw the saw near his throat and clenched his teeth. Starks pulled his friend out from under the saw and flew into the distance with him. Next noticed that the guy had dragonfly eyes, faceted, and he whistled. The man realized that he had read the movement of the chainsaw, for the one who came here to get rid of his insect threw words at him. He's too good at this. Next finished and walked between the guys with his saw. They scattered in different directions. The monster flew into him, and this word caused pain. His eyes opened. He was dumbfounded. Next extended his hand to Starks. He ran back, and the professor said in a rough bass voice. Just then, Kayla ran up, snatched the guy from under the professor's hand, and looked back, running away with him. The girl shouted to the young man that he needed to get ready. He thanked her for her help. They stopped and watched as the man attacked Sonek, and a representative of the department shouted and asked him to be careful. He slipped underneath the working saw. The guy laughed at the professor, let him rest. He buried next in the clay with his powerful foot, and the mask wouldn't hurt him either. The professor got up and threw dirt at him. They have no respect. Sonek used a smoke screen. Next looked through it. They ran away, tried to be quieter, but still were indignant at how much energy the man had. In the underground detention center of the nest, a girl with the head of an insect walked, leaving corpses behind. There, in a cell, a man was imprisoned in chains, undressed to the waist, his claw hands immobilized. Bringing her head closer to the bars, the girl lamented how someone could be left alive like this. She would like to open it quickly, but she has a simple Hanema student pass, which is of no use. That's why she prepared something, turned around, looked somewhere to the side. There was a figure standing there. The b-boy ran and had a red admission card in his hand. He was glad that it was lectures and he was not caught. Having embraced the boy, they smiled at each other. It was very nice of him. As if he had woken up from a dream, the boy did not understand why he had stolen the professor's thing. His eyes widened. He let out a scream. He didn't know who this woman was next to and why he did this. The girl hugged the boy tighter to her chest. Don't worry, she leaned the card against the lock. The green light turned on, indicating that the door was opening, and the girl invited the boy to say hello. The mantis guy coming out of captivity took off the tourniquets from his hands. He saw them. They were also insect people. Just sensing the smell from them, the praying mantis looked completely crazy. This smell drove him crazy. The girl grabbed the boy by the shoulders, pressed him back to her. Everything was as the head said. He is more of an insect. She threw the little bee straight to meet him. It was a gift from her. The praying mantis hovered over the frightened little bee. Food, he was given food. The girl stood in the middle of all this house. Pools of blood, severed limbs. These are the remains of a bee. She raised her mask. Her eyes sparkled. How amazingly, she whispered. Even after turning into a beetle, the blood is still red. A flock of crows flew off the building. Alarmed, they screamed. Starks was tired. He stopped with his hands on his hips. Sweat was pouring down his face. He didn't have the strength to do anything. Half of the lecture ran through. The rest pulled up and looked around. Only the hero was indignant that this was a test. While they were running, almost everyone was caught. They would all be expelled. Next carried away the next caught by the leg. Having thrown his students into one pile, the professor never threw words into the wind. so most likely they will no longer be the best. Starks looked at the professor. He considered him crazy. The guy sat down. He couldn't do it anymore. He really regretted that he didn't get to take Professor Max's course. Kayla advised him to be patient a little. Looking up at the girl, he clarified that in fact he would leave everyone without anything. But this was his teaching method. Sonek turned to them, put his finger to his lips, calling for silence. "He is coming here!" They watched as two girls ran, but one tripped and fell to the ground. The professor's legs came closer and closer. The saw was also in his hands. The girls tried to explain that she had twisted her ankle, but the man did not want to listen and forced her to run. They looked at him in horror because she couldn't run, but he didn't care. Professor next looked down at the girls, frowning. So why sit and wait? He raised the chainsaw and pointed it at them. They covered themselves with their hand. Starks couldn't resist. He jumped up and grabbed the saw, holding it. Next's gaze fell on the guy. He didn't understand. He wasn't going to let go of his saw. The young man shouted, "The professor is already going too far. This can't be done." The girl and the guy stared at him. What was he doing? They started to rush towards him, but for now they decided to wait. If everything was real, then they would already be dead. The guys will also have to explain when they want to devour him, the professor suggested. He wasn't joking when he said that those caught would fly out of here. Smoke started coming from the saw. Stark stared at him wide-eyed. They still had an hour left, plenty of time. But if they can deliver one single blow to him, then he will turn a blind eye to all the mistakes today. But if they can't do this, then Starks, Soneka, Kayla will be thrown out. This is not the time to think about others, about newcomers. He still has a long way to go. The professor has finished. While Next was trying to convey information to the students, two from the cell stood on a hillock and examined the area. The girl looked and tried to understand what the mantis wanted. It flickered from side to side. The guy was exhausted. He was attracted by the smell, a very tasty and familiar smell. He realized that it was the smell of that same dragonfly. His mouth filled with saliva, dripping down his chin. Having flown into the distance, Starks digested the information. There are two options for events. About to deliver this very blow, the guy swung. He thought very simply. The fist was already near Professor Next's face. A little more and he would achieve his goal. But the guy missed, walked past. The man simply stepped aside. There was a man's voice next to Starks' head, saying that he was so slow and weak. The guy tried to attack the professor every now and then, but he deftly avoided him. Sonek watched, gritting his teeth. The man could be softer. Kayla was also in solidarity. Starks still has a chance, turning on his dragonfly vision and focusing on the strike. Professor Next frowned. He saw the dragonfly's compound eyes again. The guy unconsciously perceives him as an enemy and flies up to him. Satisfied, Starks grabbed the professor, swung it, opening his mouth, got caught, he screamed. But the man quickly twisted his hand, thereby knocking the young man to the ground. The two who were watching the battle were angry. The grinding of their teeth was too loud. The girls also sat and did not move. They huddled together in fear. The man was starting to get angry. He didn't think the guy would do anything stupid. Sprawled on the ground, Starks wondered how he could compete with him. Did not understand what to do. Throwing his head up, he looked at the professor, curious what kind of bug he was. He also became an insect man because of the juice of the jungle. But a man cannot use his abilities. Due to his age, he begins to have side effects. Next showed a saw. He carries a weapon for protection, the guy exclaimed at such a revelation. Putting his hands on his hips, the professor looked at Starks. They are young and full of strength, but they won't be able to push on for one reason. The man pointed to the dragonfly, which sat on the guy's chest. Without taking his eyes off it, the hero did not breathe. The character jumped on the spot, screamed. The professor was ashamed of him because it was just a figurine. Having become serious, Next said that the guy was limiting his nature, and that's where the problems came from. He asked Starks what he knew about dragonflies. Nothing more than that their wings were fragile and their eyes, which he often used. Having addressed everyone, the first thing they need to do is learn. Everyone began to listen carefully. They all need to accept that they are insects now. Starks looked at the figurine in his hand. It was difficult to accept this because the guy hated insects so much. Suddenly, everyone was interrupted by a light clapping of the palm, an unknown woman praising the speech. The professor and student looked at the unexpected guests and were surprised that they were interrupted. The girl came out and walked towards them. She said that there was nothing surprising in such a fiery speech by the professor. "This is called real teaching, I'll teach you, I'll scare you." The girl in the mask laughed. The students were surprised and opened their mouths at what they saw and heard. Throwing aside the girl who was sitting and blocking the path to the professor, she swore. Starks was stunned by her speed and simply stood and watched as she approached. Sonek could not stand it, screamed and galloped towards her to attack. Kayla screamed after him. The guy did not reach his goal. He screamed. His gaze fell down to his chest, where he was pierced. Understanding took hold of him. A poisonous sting pierced his chest. Kayla ran to help. She screamed loudly, but Sonek's hand had already slid down. The girl pressed the guy to her chest. He is paralyzed, so it doesn't hurt him. Starks watched as Sonek whispered something in her ear, but did not understand what was happening, and this woman was also an employee of the university. It dawned on him that she had already fed him one, but that was not enough. My eye twitched. I heard the word fed. A drop of sweat rolled down my cheek. Starks remembered the day at the cinema, but suddenly the professor standing next to him was pierced by a claw. Turning around at the scream, Kayla screamed even louder and saw what had happened to the professor. The hero looked at Next, who was covered in blood and helpless. That guy, the praying mantis, stood in front of him at full height. Drool was flowing from his mouth. He was glad to meet again. Kayla saw a praying mantis, but it was different from the one she saw in the cinema. He didn't react even when the girl in the mask called him. He needed to take a walk. And yet they left, taking Sonek with them. Kayla ran up to the professor. As they left, the couple shouted not to die. Everyone else looked at them. Turning to them, the girl lifted her mask, smiled, and promised to return. Kayla could barely contain her rage as she rushed forward, gritting her teeth. But a bloody hand grabbed the girl's wrist, holding her in place. Next held her. These are dangerous people. He is contacting the university. Kayla has never been so angry. There is no time. It may be too late. They took Sonek away. If they hesitate, he will be finished. The guy did not come to his senses. The professor stood his ground. He grimaced, saying that as students you don't belong here. Without hearing anyone, Starks flew up, his hands clenched into fists, determined. The professor tried to shout to him that he shouldn't fly alone. The hero would still be expelled, because he didn't cope with the task. Starks turned his smiling, open face. He can forget about these lame university rules. The character flew after those scoundrels, and Next and Kayla were left behind. They tried to stop him, but nothing worked. The guy lamented that while he was in fear of the praying mantis, Sonek was taken away. He used his vision again. He behaved like a coward, so now he will be decisive. I quickly saw this couple. They were walking along the path. In no hurry, the mantis was carrying Sonek on his shoulder. The professor watched the guy with an angry gaze. He still didn't understand why he taught you to run away. No matter how strong you are, there will always be someone stronger than you. Therefore, the professor first taught how to run away from the enemy and evaluate his strength. For the dragonfly, the mantis is a predator. It can eat it with pleasure. The guy laughed, showing sharp teeth. A sudden attack was good but useless, was heard from him. The mantis turned towards Starks. He smelled him. They met face to face. Barely able to escape the blow, the hero forced himself not to panic. Starks was going to keep his distance in the air. He was afraid of its claws. The guy was concentrating on how to maneuver it so that he could strike. I thought that he would now raise his fist, swing it, and he would suffer. The fist was brought straight to the jaw, at which the mantis laughed, egging the hero on. Throwing Starks away, he flew away from him, leaving a stream of blood behind him. He looked in surprise at his broken fist. The character wondered what was wrong with his skin, but since he had refreshed himself, his body gained strength. The praying mantis was about to leave, but since the guy himself came to him, then he would eat him, towering over the guy. Fear appeared in Stark's eyes. He looked at the figure helplessly. He could not defeat this monster. He remembered how he had felt such horror in the cinema, and he also could not do anything about it. Frightened, the guy tried to shield himself from the praying mantis approaching him. He felt his death nearby. The girl in the mask leaned her back against the tree, folded her arms on her chest. She was bored. Let him kill him already, and they would move on. She held Sonek with her sting, did not come to his senses, and was worried that people from the nest would arrive here soon. Gradually, he began to come to his senses, especially since someone's annoying voice was calling him. But it was difficult to open his eyes. This voice belonged to Starks. He was trying to wake up his friend while he was attacking the mantis. Sonek didn't understand what was wrong with him and how he ended up here. He sat and tried to come to his senses. The girl looked at him. The poison was finishing its effect, but still the condition was bad. She decided to kill him. She didn't care what kind of meat, dead or alive. Sonek understood the whole situation, he swore, but could not move. But Starks repelled the attack, rushed across the girl. He pushed her away from her friend. The hero turned to him, ordered him to run and hide so that at least someone could survive. He himself was covered in blood. Sonek looked at him. His teeth gritted. He called the new guy. Starks was a little busy. He tried to dodge the attack of the mantis, which launched its weapon at him. His friend was surprised that he was rushing at the enemy to protect someone. Remembering the conversation in the room then, Starks ran out to save the headman. Does this mean that he likes her? Waved his hands at Sonek? It was not so. Without even hearing a thank you for saving him, the character will not regret anything. Sonek looked at the newcomer, and in his eyes there was the realization that it was impossible to do otherwise. Someone grabbed the guy by the scruff of the neck, threw him back, and fell over. It was Sonic. He grabbed Starks and ran away with him, gathering all his strength looking back. The couple was discouraged. They looked at these two, how they were able to run away so quickly and far. But Sonic did not waste time. He was further and further with every minute. Although the laziness of grasshoppers has been emphasized in fables, in reality this is not at all the case. A true grasshopper is a carnivorous insect of the order Orthoptera, with long and fast hind legs. They use them for high-speed movement and hunting, so they can jump distances longer than their body. Without any effort, Sonic galloped and dragged Starks. They fled. The character looked with a sad look. Turning himself into minced meat came to him. With this, he was a little hasty. Sonic snapped. He ran resolutely, gritting his teeth and looking forward. The girl in the mask offered to simply give up if the mantis could not catch him, looking at him half-turned. Stretching his neck, the monster did not want to give up. He looked where the guys ran away. Having sniffed and looked around, the guy felt that they were somewhere nearby. The smell was lurking. They were nearby, stopped. Sonic walked toward Starks, not understanding what he was saying. The grasshopper's face was distorted by a scream. He pointed his finger at the guy, shouting that they could defeat the praying mantis. Starks looked like a chop, and he knew it. His friend kept telling him that he had to run away if they couldn't cope with the enemy. That's what happened in class. If you make a mistake, they will die. Sonic tried to convey to the young man. This is not a sucker, but a serious opponent. Therefore, they need to kill him, the hero snapped, making his friend surprised. Starks screamed. If this is not done, then someone like him will not get to school. He leaned forward from his scream. They will only delay him until help arrives, because the professor has already called. The character put his finger forward, smiled. He had an idea. He caught fire. At this time, Next was lying in the clearing. Kayla was bending over him. She was pressing the wound and did not know what to do. She was very worried about the guys, but she couldn't leave the professor in this state. Something caught her attention. She turned her head but couldn't see anything. What it was, the girl never calmed down. She felt someone. The professor opened his eyes slightly. He could not do anything. Exhausted, he lay on the grass. The masked girl and the praying mantis were looking for the guys, but couldn't find them. They lost them. The man turned around sharply. His eyes sparkled. The wonderful smell beckoned. The smell appeared from the side. Starks jumped out from somewhere above and threw a vine around the girl's neck. Everything happened very quickly. No one noticed these movements. And now the girl in the mask is trying to free her neck from the noose. The mantis was angry at the kid's speed, at the trick he was using. Having quickly tied the girl to a tree, Starks went to the guy, who saw glasses on him. The mantis was confused. He looked and did not understand where such strength came from. The hero kicked his opponent in the face. He leaned back. Blood gushed in different directions. The monster laughed. It still didn't hurt him, he told the guy. His eyes were clouded with a red veil. Starks jumped back and fell to the ground, the mantis's body still hard. There was no way to break through. The monster was already advancing, drool dripping onto the grass from its mouth. He said that at the top of the chain, even such an insect could not defeat him. Starks volunteered to distract his attention with himself. He could hold out for a few minutes. Sonic used his legs and returned, ran through the water, trying to make it in time. He brought that thing to the hero, threw it at the guy, and the battle unfolded. Next knew what the guys had taken. Kayla asked what exactly, but he didn't answer. Through the pain, the professor grinned. They pulled it right out from under your nose. Victory will be yours. His weapon, Starks, flew on top of the mantis. He was holding a saw in his hands. He raised the professor's chainsaw over the monster, who couldn't believe his eyes. In the wild, a dragonfly cannot defeat a praying mantis. It cannot compete with it. But this only works for insects. Bring the saw, cut this bastard, and be done with it. People will find a way. A guy flew up and sawed off one of his hands, screamed loudly. The monster screamed in pain. His hand was cut off. Blood gushed out in a stream in different directions. Spun in a circle, waving his arms, splashes of blood flying and falling on everything around him. The guys were surprised that they managed to saw him, and even kissed his hand. They looked at the mantis. The man hunched over, swore, called them useless maggots, and walked towards them with the intent to kill. He was very angry. Angry because they treated him like a victim. He attacked Starks, who shook his head to the sides. His saw would not start. The praying mantis struck the guy with his whole hand. He managed to put it up for defense. The monster bent down, lowered its head, and was preparing to attack the boy. He hit him in the chest with his sting. The light began to glow around them. The guy screamed. The saw scattered over small parts. Starks looked at it with his mouth open, was shocked by what he saw. His eyes widened with fear. He flew away from the mantis, and it began to burst into laughter. Now all he had to do was run like last time. He was unable to defeat it. Lowering his head, Starks ground his teeth. His gaze was mad. Now what will he do without the saw? Sonic kicked the monster in the back. He shouted that they wouldn't blow away the sucker with one hand, and the blow staggered from the blow. He looked at the man with a fierce gaze. They were natural enemies in nature. To prevent the uncontrolled reproduction of individuals, nature came up with a rather cruel solution. She created creatures capable of bringing down enemies from heaven to earth with overwhelming superiority. Stark saw that Soneka was grabbed by the monster, clenched his fist, his eyes glowed green, and rushed straight towards the enemy. The guy grabbed the whole hand of the mantis. He was busy with another young man. He couldn't cope with two at the same time. The monster turned to Starks, caught him, and now gleefully added that he could eat him. Sticking out his black tongue, licking his lips, his eyes glowing red, it was a glorious hunt. The guy was in shackles, trying to get out, covered in blood. He wanted to hold out until people from the academy came. Opening its terrible mouth wide, the monster approached Starks' face. The young man did not want to die. He closed his eyes and closed his eyes. A light appeared. This light threw the mantis away from the guy. Starks covered his eyes from the bright light. A voice came scolding him for getting into all this. It was Professor next. He blocked the guy with his back and prepared to attack. Seeing the living professor, the young man screamed. How did he manage to recover so quickly? He saw how he was pierced through. At the sight of the wound, everything was intact. Only there was a hole in the t-shirt. As a reminder, Next received treatment from those who arrived from the nest. They have someone at the university who can treat such wounds, and he found them in the footsteps of Sonic. Looking at the mantis, the professor was worried that the guys had died, but they were able to give a worthy rebuff to him. Starks ran up to Sonic, lifting him up. Next glanced over his shoulder. The newcomers did an excellent job against a natural enemy. The mantis stood up and smiled. He moved towards the professor, but he was ready to fight back. Last time he was taken by surprise, but not this time. The monster rushed forward, saliva flying from his mouth. He would eat to his fill. He didn't care how many people there were. Next all lit up and began to smoke. He frowned, and sarcastically thanked him for ruining the lecture and the hole in him. The praying mantis flew up to attack. He opened his mouth and made sounds. The professor was ready for this. Starks looked at Next, surprised that his hand began to smoke. The bombardier beetle, this insect has unique features. They can mix chemicals in their body to create heat, fight off predators, and release the mixture. Creates an explosion, the professor's fiery fist flying straight towards the target. There was an explosion. Everything was red around. The guys looked at this spectacle. The stunned guys looked with round eyes. Starks raised his hand to his mouth. The professor, with his fire, caused the praying mantis to lie on the ground, fried. All on fire, he looked at Next with empty eye sockets. This happened to everyone who used the insect complex. Stark stood up, opened his mouth. The power of insects, he heard it for the first time. The guy exclaimed in admiration. With one explosion, that praying mantis was simply blown away. Looking down at the professor's hand, Stark saw how it was seized by a slight trembling. This side effect was remembered by him. Turning, Next turned to the guy. This would concern him too. When he took possession of the complex, he paid his price. His condition is now deplorable, so he will not recover. There is no need to end up like him. Starks looked in doubt. He needed to make his powers his own as quickly as possible. Night fell on the campus. The incident came to an end, and everyone returned safe and sound. But the guys still ended up in the medical unit. They were lying next to each other on the beds. They had lacerations on their bodies. They were almost intact. They suffered from both poison and blows. In the ward, the young people were happy that they would not be expelled. Everything had turned out well. Security would be strengthened, because the praying mantis was locked up again. The only thing that haunted Starks was that they had lost the masked woman who freed him. The guy got up on the bed, took the tablet, and began to study something there. Sonic became curious about what he was reading there. On the tablet, he read information about dragonflies. As the professor said, he needed to make the complex his own. That same night, the moon shone brightly through the window in the medical part of the university. Starks was sleeping peacefully on the bed. The next bed was empty. Sonic sat up abruptly on the bed. His bandages fell off him, and did not pay attention to anyone. His sting wound was throbbing and sending purple lines all over his body. Drawn by someone, the guy followed the inaudible call through the forest, without controlling himself. Bare legs met the slender legs of a girl. This was her call. Ampulicide, her insect, injected its poison, turning into zombie-like creatures. The girl took Sonic's chin with her finger. He did not understand anything. Bringing her face closer to the guy's face, she whispered seductively that this place was disgusting and looked like a cage. She wrapped her arms around the young man's neck and began to squeeze, saying that the nest could not protect anyone. But as soon as she fell silent, the light illuminated and threw her away from Sonek. It was the professor. He deliberately left the sting in place, even though he saw it. No matter what she plans, a fire has lit up on her hand and will go to the girl. Clenching his strength into a fist, Next resolutely approached her. Sonek was not himself behind the man. Biting her finger, the girl smiled a dreamy smile. She was ready for the meeting. Darkness, forest and clearing in which there are three, the professor named the girl's name, Shiria. They can talk. Starks watched all this from behind the branches and followed Sonek, because he was like a sleepwalker. He didn't understand what was happening here. The professor sat down next to the guy. The hero did not take his eyes off what was happening. He heard Next's words and his eyes widened. He learned that they knew each other. She used to study here, Starks wondered. Shiria folded her arms over her chest. He raised his hand to his mouth. She looked at Next. Everyone understood perfectly well that there was no point in chattering. The girl slowly walked towards the professor, laughing. And here you should ask why I'm doing this. Scratching his head, Next revealed that he wanted to show respect to a former student whom he had not seen for a long time. But if she insists, the professor runs towards her, ready to attack. Hit with a wave of light, Shiria flew away. The man's fist was driven into the ground. He frowned his eyebrows, looked sternly from under his forehead. He would beat her and return her to the nest. Shirley laughed, put her fingers to her mouth. She was having fun, and didn't take Next's threat seriously. I looked at her. She deserves nothing more after the murders of innocents. Gathering his strength, he launched a wave at the girl, bent down himself, and the light reached its target. There's no need to get so excited. She turned to the professor, amusement dancing in her eyes. The worst was yet to come. Her sting danced near his neck. But the man waved her away, throwing her to the side and raising his hand. But she quickly turned around and was ready to rush at the professor again. A rough male voice stopped this useless slaughter and gave a short command. Calm but serious, Professor Max stopped this fight. His hand was in his trouser pocket. His posture was relaxed. He suggested that Shirley finish this and go their separate ways. Otherwise, there would soon be security here. Next turned to Max. There was someone behind her, some kind of leader. He said as he walked that it was better to follow her. The conversation was in a whisper, so that not a word would escape. The girl heard the guards approaching and left, but reminded the professors of what to be afraid of. Shirley smiled. She would finish each of them. She promised them. The professors were silent. The guards were combing the area. They wanted to be sure that everything was in order. The security coped with the fire. They called for help. The men exhaled. Max reprimands the professor that it is stupid to personally rush into a showdown with a former student while being wounded. Shirley is under surveillance. We'll leave it to them, muttered the professor. But first, Max looked. You need to discuss something, he drawled. Starks supported Sonek and led him towards the professors. The professor was returning to the university, carrying Sonek on his shoulder and the hero next to him. They discussed what should be done after arriving. After the conversation ended, they walked side by side and felt awkward. Next looked over his shoulder at the guy. He needed to keep what he saw a secret. That woman was a student. She left after one incident 5 years ago. There was no news from her for many years, but now she has returned and wants to attack the nest. The professor asked Starks to remain silent. They will tell you when the time comes, but the guy asked for a favor. Putting his hand to his chest, the guy turned around. He wanted to learn a strength complex. He remembered the professor's words that he needed to accept himself. It would be difficult, but he was ready. And today, Starks felt weak. He just watched his friend being carried away. And if it weren't for him, he would have been dinner for a praying mantis. The guy wants to become stronger, he shouted. He doesn't know how yet, but he asks to teach him. Next grinned. The wind blew his beard. This young man wanted to make a deal. Standing opposite each other, the professor ordered him to get ready. It won't be easy. A few days passed. The students were studying. Everything was going as usual. The student canteen of the nest, the students were noisy. Everyone was engrossed in food. But there was also time for conversation. Sticking a fork into a delicious chop, there was a fried egg on top. The whole thing smoked and smelled delicious. The guys were also here. They were trying to quickly throw food into themselves. Sonek argued that he woke up in the infirmary covered in leaves. Kayla looked at Starks with a question in her eyes, but he pretended not to see or hear her and continued to chew. There was a noise in the dining room. Everyone began to whisper. The guys also looked around in search of noise. Jungle juice turns people into insects, but there are times when other hybrids appear and they are studied. Students who take part in research are taken out of class, but tomorrow this girl will come. Starks took this opportunity to find out what kind of insect Kayla was. His appearance was innocent. The girl looked at him, the fork with food froze in her hands, if that's what he wanted. That insect, related to praying mantises, the guy had sweat running down his temple with fear. He immediately remembered the monster. Sonek jumped up, leaned his hand on the table. That's why she was so strong. A girl with a scorpion's tail approached the table. She swung and hit the man standing at the table, shouting that she had returned. She put her feet up on the table, sat down on a chair, and turned to the shocked Starks and Kiala, notifying them about the group projects. The guy looked at the girl again. Usually projects are not difficult. This is part of the training. He grabbed the juice and realized that he would have to apply what he had learned. Stark studied he had classes with Professor next, so there will be practice. And yet, Kiala pointed with a fork, the professor had already formed groups. In their group, Dora, she looked arrogantly and smiling. How she combined all this remained a mystery. Sonyok, who stood up and now looked resentfully at this girl. Starks, who was at a loss and was turning his head, what to do. And Kayla pointed her finger at herself, 4 people in the group, and smiled. The guy smiled, drank juice from a straw, the girl was with him and he was happy. He liked his group, they all got together to go out for coffee. A few days later it was raining and the weather was not very pleasant. In such weather, Professor Next was playing sports in the gym. He was lifting weights. He was distracted from his work. Assistant Swan came with some information. She stood near the door and huddled, barely audibly whispering that they had an emergency. The secretary quickly gathered and revealed that the project group was pursuing a goal, and one of the team members. One died, she opened the team members on the tablet, and they were our students. Dora died. In the lecture hall of the department, the professor announces that design work has begun and names the topic of the work. The task was to leave the campus, find bottles of jungle juice, and bring them to the nest. Stark's face changed as soon as he heard the task. He looked worried. A man's hand pressed the remote control. It is necessary to return what caused hybridization with insect genes. The screen showed people who used it. It didn't go en masse, but there were those who bought it. Even tourists took it with them on a hike, and various disputes were also held, spraying it specifically on insects. It is not clear who created this juice, but the company that produced it went bankrupt, and now the information is prohibited. The good part is that the company was based on the peninsula. The damage was limited to this territory and its districts. It dawned on the hero, so he could hide it. It was not everywhere. The medicine is made from the jungle juice itself, so the task is to get as much as possible. Next folded his arms across his chest, he smiled. Whose team finds the box of pesticides, everyone will get an A. There was a whisper in the audience. The students, seduced by the high grade, whispered among themselves. Starks was also not averse to getting a high 5, but it was difficult to find jungle juice, raising his hand to his mouth. Hiding his smile, the professor ordered the students to disperse into groups. The city was in full view. Group A decided to split into pairs, Kayla and Starks, but Sonek would be with Dora. The guy was walking with a girl through the streets of the city. It would be more effective to work in 2 groups. He was uncomfortable in the city. Kayla wondered where these bottles could be found. They couldn't be found in the public domain, the hero grinned. He had an idea. Suddenly, Stark started laughing, shouting joyfully that the A was his. He grabbed the girl by the hand. He pulled her along with him. He knows where to find jungle juice. You need to trust him. They approached the building. Starks looked at Kayla and shouted that he didn't throw away his can, but left it, even though it infuriated him. Opening the door of his apartment, a smile illuminated the young man's face. But when he went inside, it faded. He turned pale as soon as he saw that there was a pogrom inside his apartment. They both looked stunned. The girl clarified that he had been robbed. He ran up to the closet, began to pull out the drawers. The can of spray should be somewhere here. Having torn out one box, it was empty. Only glue rolled lonely along the bottom. Screaming and turning his head in different directions, Starks was worried about his assessment. Kayla tried to calm him down. They would look elsewhere. He turned to her. She also used the spray. You need to go to her and take it. Without looking up, the girl whispered that they didn't need to go there. She ran out of Kayla's apartment, telling the young man that they would look for him in the city. Starks watched as the girl jumped out and began to reproach himself. Suddenly, he said something wrong. Sitting at the bus stop, they searched the internet, looked at every site. They showed the bottle in the store and asked the salesperson for availability, but there was also no result. Starks even tried to cheat and paint another bottle, but Kayla stopped his impulse. After taking a break, they each took iced coffee. There wasn't even a clue to find this spray. The guy sighed, how hard it was to find him. The girl wanted to return to the university before curfew. Starks wondered who took his jar. Kayla looked at him strangely. She rested her cheek on her hand. She didn't know why she was so obsessed with getting rid of her wings. Embarrassed, he did not look up from his glass and looked slyly. Kayla smiled, laughed. This is for that girl from the movie theater, Starks choked. He covered his mouth with his hand, from which coffee was flowing, and tried to justify that Mia was not so important. The guy froze without removing his hand. His eyes widened. He realized something. But he would like to get his life back, both her and the university. He lowered his head. Despite the fact that Mia pushed him away, the guy does not consider her bad, because the praying mantis tried to kill her, and all hybrids look disgusting. Kayla lowered her eyes. She thought that Starks was a strong man, and she would be in his place. But the guy interrupted her. He grabbed his hands and was grateful to the girl for coming for him. Starks remembered that day. Only thanks to the girl he found a goal. Embarrassed, he wanted to say this for a long time, but he said it and felt awkward. Kayla was pleased. She smiled and remembered how the guy doubted at first. She raised her hand to her hair, looked at him. "Now you don't regret coming with me," she smiled sweetly. Starks was pleased to look at her and smiled back. He laughed and asked the girl. She had been a prefect since the first semester, the young man clarified. She probably also wants a family, so he should defeat her first, he joked. Kayla closed herself off, pulled her cap over her eyes. She didn't want to come back. Starks looked surprised. He wanted to tell her something, but they called him. It was Sonic. They found something, so they need to meet. He talked about the abandoned warehouse where jungle juice was stored. This is their jackpot. If they take the bottles from there, they will not only have the highest score, but will also provide the university with a supply for creating Cinderella. Kayla jumped at what she heard. The guy was happy, smiled, and looked at her. She rushed to the phone, but the guy was already shouting the address, telling them to hurry up. Starks turned his head, but Kayla was already running, shouting that they needed to get there faster. The task was to find bottles that had already been sold. The professor tried to find unsold products and was unsuccessful. The girl clenched her fists. The guy jumped up too, and now they find a warehouse full of it. It looks like a trap. When they landed on the ground, Starks was flying with Kayla. Night had already fallen on the warehouse. It was a creepy place. The girl was curious how they found this place in the first place. Starks had an unpleasant feeling from this place. Kayla was already running inside, the guy clenching his fists, and followed. They walked through a dark warehouse. The guy wondered if it was a trap, catching up with the girl. Having illuminated the shelves with a flashlight, the young man saw dust. Everything seemed plausible to him. The girl began to look for the others. Who would think of setting such a trap? The girl slowed down. The light passed over a full box of bottles of jungle juice. Grabbing the bottle, Starks still hoped that it was not a trap. Kayla's sudden fall attracted attention. Blood appeared unexpectedly. The guy was confused. He watched silently as the girl's hair flew up. A guy appeared from the darkness, hunched over. The darkness hid his face. Instead of a hand, he had a large, sharp claw, and he found prey. The girl was lying on the floor, blood oozing from the wound, forming a puddle. Starks's face darkened. He clenched his teeth. His nodules were moving with anger. He quickly flew up to the guy, darkness accompanying his every movement. When Starks was little, his grandfather said he said goodbye to his parents, learned to say goodbye to everyone. Not in this case. The little boy sat in the funeral hall with his back pressed against the wall. Saying goodbye to those who were close, it's impossible to get used to. The girl is in a pool of blood. The guy with a pierced eyebrow and lip looked at Starks. Soon he would join his girlfriend. The common drywig hunts with the help of powerful forceps on its body. Starks used his dragonfly eyes, gritted his teeth, and cursed. The fist is put forward. The guy rushed to attack. He fights back. The fist reaches its target. The monster throws back its head, spitting out saliva and teeth. He flew back. Starks looked at the guy. He hit him right in the jaw. But here he towers over the hero, bares his teeth, and says that he is fine. From the blow, the young man's knuckles are broken. Blood flows out. His skin is hard. Memory told Starks that the mantis had the same thing, an exoskeleton. The monster's arm became longer and curled in different directions, and he swore at the guy because he had a dragonfly complex, but he did not absorb. The hero showed curiosity that it turned out to be devouring another hybrid. Carnivorous insects can eat others. The guy heard this and grimaced. I remembered the hybrid. Saliva rolled down my chin. It was like a piece of meat with drugs. I couldn't tear myself away. And while he was absorbing in euphoria, he made a discovery for himself. The more he eats others, the stronger he becomes, the more powerful his hand. In a society where those with money have power, he was a worm at stake. But now he can escape from restrictions. He has felt a taste of power. Madness consumed him. His eyes glowed red and saliva flowed from his mouth. Someone told me to hide in this warehouse, get food, and thank you later. The monster will devour both of them, and no trace will be found. He extended his hand towards the character. Stretching out his powerful arm, which had been structurally changed, the guy was ready to devour Starks. The hero lowered his hand on it and squeezed it so hard that it pierced the armor of his hand. He leaned his other hand on the other side of his arm and lowered his head. He sharply raised his eyes and screamed about Kiala, squeezing his hands and pressing on the monster's hand. Starks flew towards the guy, his face expressing rage, clenching his fists. He struck so hard that everything around him lit up. and the monster fell back. He winced from the blow, threw his head back, and the blow hit his cheek. The tail's modified hand slashed at Stark's leg, causing blood to flow. His hair flew up, a scream escaped the guy's open mouth, his eyes widened in pain. Extending its arm, the monster threw the hero as far as possible, and now stood and looked at him. A bottle of jungle juice spray lay next to Stark's, his legs trembling. Leaning his hand on the shelving behind him, the character rose to his feet and looked at the monster with a furious gaze, his entire body trembling. If the guy with the long arm thought, he was on a completely different level. He lowered his hand, the blow fell on the rack, which could not withstand such treatment, and crumbled. Starks didn't care what level he was at, he continued to attack him. The monster continued to swing its arm and the goal was achieved, knocking the guy down. Starks stubbornly flew at him. His whole face was covered in blood, but he didn't care how many times he fell. Despite his wounds, the guy still screamed and fought. He swung his hand at the monster. I thought I could kill him, but I struck him. Sparks flew in all directions. The monster even felt this fist, which he reported to Starks. The sweaty young man, covered in blood, raised his head. He could not cause any damage. Again, he threw his hand towards the guy, demolished the boxes, and managed to fly Starks away. A memory surfaced in my memory of how Professor Nex taught, there is another way. He crouched down, preparing for the attack, trained every night with him, he would be able to use it. He wanted to use it now, flew at the monster, but he raised his hand and launched it at the young man. Looking at his wings, they did not move. Starks did not understand what was wrong with his wings. The wings dropped. The monster, seeing his confusion, began to laugh. Starks remembered the professor's words that he had paid the price using the complex understanding reflected in his eyes. He sat on the floor with his head bowed and his hand was already flying at him. The monster wanted him to move. He repeated his order to move again. His hand froze near his throat. She repelled the attack of Kale, who appeared unexpectedly. Everything around lit up. Her hair flew out from the speed. She obscured Starks, who had already risen behind her. She looked at him with her eyes, did not answer the guy's question, stood ready to defend herself. There were no more wounds. The monster saw the girl. He was surprised that she had not died yet. The girl was fiddling with a lock of hair. Her clothes were torn, but there were no more wounds. She turned to him. He didn't ask about her complex and touched her cap. Starks was surprised, opened his mouth and looked at her without stopping. He didn't understand. Kayla looked back at the hand flying at her. The hand sparkled and glowed with a bright light. His hand was burning. The monster screamed when he saw it. Sweat rolled down his cheek. The girl threw it to Starks. You have to watch carefully. Now she will show her complex. She took off her cap, freeing her mustache. She will show what power she really has. The cat jumped, scared of something. A group of young people saw the girl and stared in anticipation. It was Kayla, a high school student, walking out with her head down. The guys laughed. Their laughter was directed towards the student. She did not come down. She rose from below. The children laughed louder, calling her a beggar. Kayla looked at the guys. Hatred of poverty begins with pity. Pity turns into discrimination. How could she live in such conditions? Taking photos of her on her phone to show everyone at school. These were her classmates. They zoomed in on her photo on the phone, called her a cockroach, and compared her life to one of the films. The guy looked at the photo and laughed, disgust on his face. Suddenly, the laughing guy was pushed forward. It was another young man. He kicked. The girls screamed. The guy walked past them. Turning around, he said that he was crushing beetles. Everything was fine with Kayla. She looked with her mouth open at the guy. It was the girl's older brother, Parker, a day laborer, the head of the family. A high school student with a backpack on her back entered the room and announced her arrival home. I noticed some movement on the floor. A mustachioed cockroach was running and was already on the threshold into another room. Parker was sleeping, drooling on his pillow, but got up at Kayla's call. He jumped out of the room when the girl screamed. He had a spray in his hands. Having clicked on it, I realized that I had run out, and both looked at the bottle. They screamed, didn't know what to do, looked for ways to get rid of the insect, and scared the cat. They sat next to each other, leaning on the wall, tired. They had a lot of bugs, so they quickly ran out of the remedy. Parker took the phone, read about the new product Jungle Juice, which kills with one spray. The girl laughed at it. Kayla looked at her brother with tenderness. They had nothing in the dirty basement. Parker stared dreamily ahead. He wants to send her to college. He has to do this as an older brother. Unfortunately, Kayla's brother died from overwork. He worked hard to provide for her. Poverty killed her brother. A photograph with a white ribbon, such a young and smiling young man. Poverty took away Kayla's light. She sat buried in her knees in her closet. She hoped that this was a dream. She squeezed her face with her hands, gritting her teeth. They opened the window, those same guys, they were planning something not very good. They were holding a box of something. This is because of the incident they decided to do this when Kayla's brother hit the girl's boyfriend. The girl shouted to the cockroach. She brought her friends and poured cockroaches through the bars. The girl's frightened eyes widened. Tears flowed from her eyes. She sobbed. She was afraid of these beetles. Cockroaches kept falling out of the box. Their antennae were developing. It seemed like a nightmare to Kayla. The girls emptied the box and ran. They laughed. They were very cunning for coming up with such a thing. The cockroaches drove Kayla into a corner. No matter what she did, she could not get out. Tears rolled down from her eyes in large drops. She covered her mouth with her hand so as not to scream. While crawling away from the insects, her gaze came across a bottle of jungle juice, and she remembered her brother, who said that she should try it. She grabbed the bottle with a trembling hand. She was shaking all over with fear of them. She grabbed the bottle with both hands, pressing the button, gritting her teeth. She screamed loudly and released a stream at the insects, into the darkness in which nothing was visible. Emerging from the memories, Kayla was now striking the monster. The blow was struck on the guy's long arm, cutting it in half. The guy fell. He was sure that he had already finished her off with such an attack. She ran up to him lying down. She needed to know where Sonek and Dora were, the monster swore. Starks watched it all as it all fell and turned into a heap. Struck by such power, he does not even dare to meddle in this battle. He clenched his bloody hand into a fist, wondered how she could recover so quickly. He thought she died. Kayla approached the hero. She saw his blood, but he assured that everything was fine. She herself was much more important. The girl assured that she was healing quickly, and in confirmation of her words, the hand that was covered in blood shone with light and became clean. Really quickly, the guy was amazed. This is part of her complex, to which the girl began to stutter and agreed. They were interrupted by the guy who managed to get up. He found out that Kayla was a cockroach. Movement and vitality, the monster said, indicated this and rushed to attack again. He was curious where she encountered them. In a dirty place, a sewer, or a garbage dump? Kayla clenched her teeth and could barely contain herself. In the basement, the guy did not calm down and deliberately annoyed the girl. He hit the target, so she attacked. Starks looked up. That's why she didn't say what insect hybrid she was. It dawned on the young man. He breathed out her name. He leaned his hands on the floor. Starks blamed himself for the fact that his body did not obey and lowered his head. The monster smelled the smell of destruction. He recognized this smell. Circling around, they attacked each other. The man was furious. He couldn't hit it. It was too fast, probably because it was a cockroach. But even they are not immortal if they cannot hit it, the guy decided. He might hit Starks. I remembered him and how the girl came to his aid. A long hand reached out to the sitting guy. He could not do anything. Kayla rushed towards him, extended her hand, screamed, and her scream spread throughout the entire room. Before Starks had time to warn her, the monster's hand pierced her. Hanging on her, the girl did not make a sound. The character sat on the floor and watched as drops of blood flowed down, forming a puddle. The monster's face twisted into a grin. He achieved what he wanted. Starks looked shocked. Blood was everywhere. The monster was gloating. He advised him not to be upset, because if she had not become a hybrid, she would have died anyway. The girl lay covered in blood. With her eyes open, the monster continued that the poor do not survive in this society. The guy stopped short, looked at something. His eyes narrowed. He didn't understand what it was. Stark's entire body was pierced by a green color, rising in the air and changing. The insect man looked at the guy with all his eyes, how his wings became larger and greener, how he rose from his knees. The wings are shining and the head is lowered. The monster wondered if this was part of the complex, but this was not the case. He hasn't absorbed anyone yet, according to him, so the changes happened because of this girl. The guy was very surprised that there are ways besides absorption to become stronger. Charming, he licked his lips, thought that if he ate it now in this state, he would get all the substances he needed. He was interested in what would happen and put his hand in his direction. But while the guy was releasing his insect, Starks was already below, ready to strike. Having thrown it away, Starks will not feel sorry for anyone. There is no room for that. The monster fell into the boxes. Everything scattered, sparkled, and the hero looked away. The collapsed man was grinding his teeth. He could not get up on his own. Starks, without looking up, took the claw in the guy's hand. He was angry. Squeezing your hand, gritting your teeth, swearing at the hero, if you use jungle juice, you will become a monster, stronger than a person, while maintaining your mind and rationality. Now you don't feel anything human about him. His eyes are crazy and his mouth is covered in blood. That's how Starks was. The frightened monster tried to hide, to protect himself from the guy, but it didn't work. Stark's hand grabbed the guy's face. He couldn't escape his grip. Pressing his face to the floor, saliva dripping from his mouth, he tried to swear at him, pinched with his hand. I told him to watch the rear. A guy's hand with a sharp claw was moving towards the hero. Turning towards the claw, the guy opened his mouth and the claw went inside. The dragonfly is armed with not only compound eyes and wings. The monster looked with an open eye from the trap. Dragonflies have a highly organized chewing apparatus with which they break their prey. So the guy, using this from a dragonfly, bit the sharp claw on his hand. An unknown force, the monster wondered what it was. Starks spat out the remains. During classes with the professor, the young man not only practiced, but the theory was also discussed. In theory, it was said about even greater strength, the stance of an insect. However, squeezing the monster's face with your hand more tightly makes it extremely difficult to control this force. Maybe your complex will swallow you whole. The guy's eyes sparkled green. His whole body was on fire. The guy on the floor realized that he was different if he went devouring one after another. Today, he chose the wrong victim. The target turned out to be stronger than him. The gap between their species, the monster shouted. His eyes widened. He was in pain and scared. Ripping his hand away from the insect, Starks began to rise. Feeling his death, the monster began to beg, ask him to stop, say that he was sorry. But Starks no longer listened to him. He continued to bite into his body, tearing with his teeth what could not be harmed with his fists. The pieces flew in different directions. The hero did not stop. The guy under him screamed. All torn, not a body, but a piece of meat covered in blood. The monster asked him to stop and not kill him. But Starks did not pay attention to the requests and pleas. He crushed the skull with his hand. He lifted his body with one hand and screamed very loudly from all the pain. The man stopped everything. He walked by and Starks fell behind him. We must not allow the watchdog to be devoured by the victim, wrapped in threads around the passed-out guy. He looked at the monster. He was no longer useful to them, although she would return him. But his feet moved closer to the young man, who would have thought that this one would be an exception, like Sharia. He sat down, leaned towards him, lifted his head, and he said that he was also from the nest. He pressed his face to the guy's face. He breathed into his lips that he wanted him. But the nest's bloodhounds were already doing their job, so they didn't linger. Starks came to his senses. A voice reached him, but he did not understand what was happening. There was a blurry figure in his eyes. He told him that he would be an even bigger monster. The bloodhounds were in place. They were running towards the warehouse. The signal came from here. After reading the sign, they had a bad feeling, but they approached the entrance. Starks carried Kayla in his arms. He screamed and called for help. She was not breathing. Heavy rain, the entrance to the nest, and a professor under an umbrella with his assistant. Starks came out of the warehouse in silence, carrying Kayla in his arms, lowered his head, and did not have the strength to look at anyone. There was noise, screams, requests to call a doctor. Next approached the guy. While everyone was making noise, the wet man asked one single question. What happened? Stark's eyes were not visible from under his bangs. When he began to talk about how they ended up here, his voice changed. The professor was very angry. He raised his fist and slammed it into the air, and there was silence again. Grabbing him by the shoulder with his hand, he shook him. Nex didn't understand. He had a lot of questions. Anger showed in every movement of the professor. The guy looked at the capture. They had a task to find only bottles. A drop of rain rolled down his chin. Starks was sad. How everything turned out to be death. The man was indignant. Women in white cloaks approached them and stopped the conversation between the men, calling Nex a stinking bug. Squinting his eyes towards the ladies, the man was dissatisfied with the fact that he was interrupted. A woman with red hair, a tenured professor, Karen, she approached him with a question about the stretcher. He wanted to know why they came. They need to be sent back. But the woman is always there where the patient is. Starks watched them and seemed to come to his senses when he was asked to let her go. Already on the ground, Kayla's hand was raised over the wounds. Everything lit up. The guy bent down. He screamed. He didn't understand what they were doing. A seed appeared on Karen's head, and liquid appeared on her hand. But the professor's assistant clarified that this is such a treatment, such a specific complex for her. Part of the complex is fireflies, and the other part is a parasitic fungus that selects insects as its host, known as cordyceps. Its properties are still being actively studied. It provides energy and healing properties. The professor's complex, the assistant smiled, holding an umbrella over Karen. The most unique in the entire nest, a light shone above Kayla. It was a treatment. And the wounds on the girl's body began to disappear, leaving her body smooth even without a scar. Starks raised his smiling face to Karen, which means she will survive. But the woman's words made the smile on his face fade, turn pale. It's too late. He won't forget these words. Her heart stopped. Karen's complex only helps heal wounds. But she cannot resurrect the dead, she finished and stood up. The hero lowered his head. His gaze did not express anything. The pain of loss was too strong to express in words. No one could utter a word. Professor Nex turned around and silently left. Everyone began to fuss. They brought a stretcher, the doctors carried the body inside, and only the young man sat on his knees. Not allowing anyone to touch Kayla, the guy picked her up and pulled her into his arms, rocking with her. Starks clenched his teeth and held the girl tightly. When they approached him to take the body, he angrily waved it off. He grabbed her by the shoulders and leaned towards her. Couldn't believe that his girlfriend was no longer there. The older brother told Kayla about the molting of insects and about beetles, among other things. She sat with her hands on her knees and listened. Many epithets are applied to them, but even they are beautiful, just like them. Embarrassed, the girl hit Parker and he burst out laughing. They were happy, not always, but there were moments. Sometimes they egged each other on like that. The older brother promised to take care of every bug on her way and extended his hand to Kayla. Even if they are poor, they don't have to give up. They have to fight. Holding Kayla in her arms, she weakly grabbed his hand with hers. Tears poured out of the green eyes. They widened. I couldn't believe it. Pieces of skin began to fall away from her body, molting or metamorphosing. Every insect goes through this to shed its old or damaged ecoskeleton and grow. The stance of a cockroach, the girl was shining. This light illuminated everything around, but she did not let go of the guy's hand. Through her hair, Kayla slowly opened her eyes, regaining consciousness. Her hair developed, and she saw Stark smile as he looked at her tenderly. He caught the girl's hand with his hand, held it, he caught that beetle, understood her without words. Tears flowed from the guy's eyes, now from joy. She doesn't need to worry, everything is fine. Kayla woke up, stood up. She didn't understand what had just happened. Without finishing, Starks threw himself into her arms, squeezing her tightly, causing the girl to blush on her cheeks. Pressing ever tighter against her shoulder, hot drops fell onto her clothes. Everyone immediately rushed back to them. The professors ran and walked, and the guy sat and sobbed, hugging Kayla. Hospital corridor, signs on the wards, Nesda Medical Center. Starks sat up in his hospital bed and asked the guys. He was ready to listen to what happened. Two stood at the door, Dora and Sonic. The guy raised his hand and scratched his head. Where they were, they had been looking for them for a long time. Sonic was sure that they had found different warehouses and mixed them up. Remembering that night, the guy and girl whistled from the place when they turned on the flashlight. A strong roar was heard and the shelves were hit. They screamed. Therefore, they were stuck there for several hours. Starks squinted his eyes to the side. It was their fault. The shelves fell, but they remained alive. They were curious about what happened to the headman, but the guy thought that he would not go into details, so he replied that she had gone to the laboratory to check her health. All that jungle juice turned out to be fake. They went back to the very beginning. Dora lay down on the bed. She was too tired. The hero looked at Sonic. He was curious how they found this warehouse, because it was deep in the mountains. He scratched his head and remembered the rather strange man who gave the tip. White hair with some kind of tint, Sonic remembered, describing that man. The piercing in the ears was strange, in the shape of a spider, but I didn't remember anything else. The dog fell on his paws. He happily waved his tail. When he saw someone, there was a bark. A girl was walking towards the dog along the corridor in which transparent boxes were displayed. The man was looking at the tablet, but when he saw her, he looked away. The man's head was in a shell of water, the man joked, how he had not yet choked, and in response he smiled. Walking along the corridor, he talked, waving his hands, about how the nest is lucky in the sense that there are many talented guys there. But today, the earwig was almost turned into minced meat. He threw back his head, his hair flew up, he closed his eyes, and the water splashed to the sides. The man hid from the droplets behind the tablet, handing him a towel. Wiping his face, he looked at the man. The conversation turned to the breeder. We need to contact the two in the nest they sent. The dog took the opportunity and licked the water on the floor. The man said that Sharia killed their water bug, the guy swore. Starks and Sonic walked along the corridor of the university. The guy was confused. Someone was watching him. He muttered that he was hiding well among the newcomers. The water spider grinned and raised his hand to his chin. Now they will have fun. After this incident, they also continued to search for the spray, but did not even find an empty can. The last day came. His group did not collect anything. Stark sat drenched in sweat, his body trembling and his hands clenched tightly. The guys sat quietly. The beginner class did not collect anything. The professor stood at the lectern. Students began to be indignant about how they could find something that was no longer for sale. The professor leaned on his side. He expected that no one would find anything. The students were even more alarmed. He knew that this would happen. He pressed the button on the remote control. The purpose of the task was to show how difficult it is to find even one can. Numbers appeared on the screen. This is how much the nest collected. Very little. This pesticide is in great demand, which is why they collected so little. There is another group of insect hybrids led by that water guy. The professor continued to show fragments, saying that there was little information about that organization. But they used jungle juice for their terrorist purposes, turning ordinary people into insects. They use dangerous species that are prohibited from being sold in pet stores, and some nest employees have been subjected to their experiments. Next listened with his hands folded on his chest. There are some of them too. They were transformed into hybrids. Dora was also here. She leaned on the desk and fingered her locks of hair. They were doing their experiments against their will. The professor put his fist and pressed. For a long time, the nest weakly dealt with them, since they were in the shadows. But recently, they created a very obvious trap just for us. Next leaned with both hands on the table, attracted attention. Now everything will be different from the first semester. The students sat silently and listened. They were given a real task. They would now seriously confront another organization. The professor was frank with them and even offered to leave the classroom. The battle with such people is very dangerous. Kill or be killed is the principle. They could get seriously hurt like Group A during this mission, or like during the escape of the praying mantis, when 2 of ours were killed. Some of you have already experienced this. Starks and Kayla listened attentively, folding their arms over their chests. Next wants to see in front of him only those who are ready to face death. The hero saw how determined Sonic was, and how Dora also agreed to this. Some of the students began to shake, afraid of further study. Starks stood up from his seat, clenched his hand into a fist. Kayla looked at him. He turned to Professor next with a question, who looked at him expectantly. Fighting these people will affect the rating? The guy raised his hand. He wanted to know. Everyone stared at him in surprise. The professor folded his arms over his chest. Next from under the forehead said that this course would be rated very highly. Then there is no reason to worry, Starks decided. Kayla opened her mouth at such a statement. The greater the risk, the greater the return. The guy smiled. He was pleased. Everyone looked at him. It was strange to hear this, and only Sonic laughed. Having returned from the other world, he aims to be the best graduate. He also decided to go to the end, to smash them all to smithereens. Dora bared her teeth, pounded her fists on the table. A real fight, she loved it. The girls also started talking about how they knew where they were going and did not want to lose to a transferred student. Kayla folded her arms across her chest, smiling. Every time they warn about danger once a semester. Previously, they only talked about injury, but not about death, so you still had to think about it. The professor looked seriously, without a hint of a smile. He liked these newcomers. They do not give up even knowing about death. As a result, after reflection, no one changed their mind about studying. The lesson was completed, next notified. From next week, there will be special lectures, but not every day. The surprised guy was holding something slimy and in a shell in his hands. This is how parties are held in the nest. Quite usually, yes, Dora poured Sonica's drink. The others shouted, danced, and had fun. Starks and Kayla sat drinking and eating. Normal behavior, even somehow unusual to see. The girl blushed. She looked at the guy, called him, but a scream was heard from the side. It was Sonic screaming. Dora was strangling him. He asked Starks for help. Dora got upset. She threw the guy aside and shouted that she wanted more drinks. She is full of energy every day. Not everyone can bear that. Starks thoughtfully asked Sonic if he was ready to get punches, and he agreed. After taking a sip of the drink, Dora is showing friendliness in such a way that he will not refuse. She hasn't really communicated with people before, and it's quite difficult for her to make contact. Starks did not know any of this, and therefore was surprised by this from Sonic. The guys noticed that someone was talking to her, holding out a can of drink. It was a guy with a bandage near his mouth, Leon. He held out a drink and offered to drink together. The trio looked up from their drinks, looking at them. Kayla, an acquaintance from the laboratory, assumed. Dora raised her face, clutched the jar tighter, and swore. Her face changed sharply. A girl jumped up, grabbed his elbow, where he had been missing for so long, and she dragged him to drink alcohol. The guys looked at this in surprise. Sonic did not bring the jar to his mouth. Saliva rolled down his chin. They continued drinking after some time, but Starks was not silent. He was making fun of his friend. But this was the first time he had seen such behavior from her, and he took a bite of his food and clenched his jaw tightly. Leon squinted his eyes, heard the guys talking, thought about it, but remained silent. Starks thought it was strange, but the guy and girl had already disappeared out the door. The guy stood on a hillock, looked at the nest tower. He wasn't caught. He was glad about it. Dora was tied hand and foot. She quickly passed out from alcohol. Leon sat down next to her. He wondered if she would wake up at all. He extended his hand to her chest. If she doesn't wake up, it's even better this way. His hand was intercepted by someone else's hand, with a sharp, quick movement. It was Starks! He shouted at the guy what he was doing while holding his hand. Leon brought his face closer to the hero's face, holding hands. Too close, eye to eye. The man asked the merman who he wanted to take, but he just grinned. He hoped it wasn't a guy with a dragonfly complex. He was afraid, because they rarely respond to training. The breeder reassured the man. Not him, he thought he needed him, but the boy was not ready yet. The man dreamily looked somewhere to the side. He liked her. They had been watching this girl for a while now, and now she was tied up and unconscious. This girl was Dora. While the party was going on at the nest, the students were having fun and shouting. Starks at this time was trying to find out who this guy was who took Dora and what he did with her. The guy's face darkened. He looked and realization came to him. He is her boyfriend. Suddenly, he interfered with him. At this, the guy stood up and asked not to talk nonsense. Starks began to become indignant, take possession of the girl with whom he was not even in a relationship, and tried to wake up Dora. Leon grabbed the hero by the shoulder and asked him to get out, but he squinted his eyes. Don't get in his way, he pushed Starks. He flew away, turned back to Dora. Black feathers flew in different directions. Starks was surprised and raised his hand, black feathers flying towards him. As soon as they touched the open skin, the guy's hand, they stuck to the body. Starks looked with a stunned look as the feather that stuck to his hand cut. Blood dripped from the cut. Starks jumped away from the feathers. Leon laughed at him and warned him that he would be more careful. It was his poisonous stubble that flew out at the guy, standing upright, he said. Leon takes Dora. Everyone has their own place and she is not here, rendered a verdict. The hero pressed his hand over the wound. He was angry. He heard that the girl would no longer return to the nest. Covering himself with his hood, Leon did not look at Starks. He does not go to their school. With a quick movement, he rushed towards the guy, putting forward his hand, which turned into a claw. He extended his hand to the guy's face. His eyes widened from the unexpected attack. Last time he overdid it with force and felt a very strong recoil. This time he will try to be more careful. His wings rushed out from under his clothes. He flew away from Leon, avoided the attack, slipped away. He missed with his hand and only grabbed the air. The guy from above was watching. Now you need to keep your distance. And how will you manage to take Dora? Raising his head, Leon warned him that he had a chance and had to get away. The guy hunched over. Black wings grew from his back. Starks watched the transformation from above. Tarantula stance, aimed strike. Leon had a lot of strength. He released the feathers. They flew up to the guy and flew at him and covered himself with his hand. There were so many feathers that the guy did not have time to dodge them. Putting his hand up, he looked at Leon through his fingers and wondered where he got such strength from. The feathers cut and slashed Stark's body as the guy looked down at him. He was covered in blood. He turned his back. He couldn't handle it alone. He needed help. But before Starks could fly away, Leon grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and dragged him somewhere. He looked at the guy as he thought he would also need to be picked up. At this time, at the party, Kayla noticed Starks' long absence. She muttered, clutching the jar. She wanted to ask him what happened that day, but someone was always bothering them. The girl drank a jar. She was upset that they couldn't stay alone. A voice called out to her. It was Sonic. He scared Kayla. She let go of the jar from her hands and screamed. He asked to call Dora. The guy was worried about her. He hadn't seen her for an hour, so he needed to call. Kayla opened her mouth. She was surprised by this. The girl from the next table raised her hand and said that she saw her. They both turned to look at this girl. She said that she saw Dora being taken out into the street by some guy. At this time, Starks tried to attack Leon, but he put out his hand and was not afraid at all. The hero flew as far away from him as possible, but the man walked towards him. Starks turned around, and there was already someone behind him, he thought quickly. Having flown even further, Leon kept up with him. He needs to fly even higher. But the guy was trapped by stubble. He looked around. It was everywhere. Starks was next to Dora, covered with a hood. There was no way out through the air. This guy looked up, trying to drive him into a trap. He made an attempt to wake Dora. Not the time to sleep, Starks thought. He heard a voice behind him. He said that it was infuriating him. He flew away from Leon again. He started talking about how Starks was acting like her boyfriend. It was none of his business at all. There was no point in meddling. It's impossible. She's a member of the group and they will fail the task without her. Leon stopped and asked again. I remembered the fun time with them. The guy grinned. He didn't want to run away. This is his chance. Leon stood and watched as Starks approached him. Using his insect complex, the guy must now overcome it. I remembered the professor's words that people have primitive instincts. They are restrained by human rationality. Upsetting the balance between the two principles and allowing the animal principle to tip the scales, Leon put up a defense against the guy's blow. Then you can show great strength parry and deliver the next blow. The blow was delivered and it hit the target. The guy was pleased with himself. But the joy quickly disappeared when, looking closely, he saw nothing. Everything swam before his eyes. Having fallen to the ground, he could not get up. His feet in black boots stood in front of him. There were 2 small holes on Stark's neck. The guy tried to be careful, because if he died, he wouldn't be greeted. Cursing, the guy recalled the moment when he was hit. Leon looked at his trembling hand. His complex was also good. He could hurt. But he still has a better complex. He raised his hand to his mouth and looked at the guy. The last thing Starks thought before passing out was that he didn't even notice the complex. He came to his senses slowly, his eyes opened. He lay in bed, did not understand how he ended up here, peered into the darkness. But nothing was visible, he wondered. Inside the building, he couldn't come up with anything. Turning his head to the side, he saw something that made him sigh. His eyes widened. Dora was lying on the pillow next to him, sleeping. She put her palm on his chest. The guy broke out in a big sweat. He couldn't say anything except make an incomprehensible sound. He raised his hand to his lips. The girl also slowly woke up, opening her eyes. Eyes wide, they stared at each other too close, their noses almost touching. Starks was already sitting on the bed, wrapped in a blanket, with marks from the girl's palm on his cheek and chest. Having checked the door and window, everything was closed. Dora sat angry on the bed. The phone also did not work. Trying to break off the board from the door, the guy muttered what was most important. "It's that they broke curfew and missed class." Starks knocked on the door. No, he heard behind him, exhaled, calmed down, and looked over his shoulder. The girl was sitting on the bed. She was indignant. She doubted that he could do this. Trying to figure out who she was talking about, they were interrupted when steps were heard outside the door. They jumped up, ran to each other. Someone was walking. They were confused. A little girl came through the door. She was holding the handle. She was asked to tell her that the food was ready. They stared at her in shock. They never expected to see a girl. When they came out, they saw a dining room where many small children were laughing and eating. The guy was unusual. He wrapped himself tighter in the blanket where they ended up. "Orphanage Angel," the voice answered him. He turned his head to the side. The girl stood in front of the table, her hands folded on her chest. "Dora grew up here," she admitted. The little girl sat at this table and ate. Her eyes watered. Starks looked at her, not knowing what to say. "This is a small orphanage in the countryside," she answered. The children surrounded Dora. They were interested in her tail. The guy also turned around. They looked with admiration and trust at the tail, the bumps, and the convex part, the same as that of a real scorpion. Barely restraining herself, Dora clenched her teeth, blushed, but could not lash out at them. She quickly ran away. The children stood and watched her trail. Starks considered it right for her to escape. A little while later, he was reading a book with the child when a woman approached. It was the director of the orphanage. She smiled and was friendly. The things were washed, hanging on a rope on the street, and the guys were running under them. "Leon brought them last night," a woman sitting at the table told them. He was also from this orphanage, so he and Dora were close. But he left them and left, asked to look after them and nothing else. Starks thought once he left, he could just fly away from here. The woman was curious if Dora was being offended there. The guy was embarrassed by this. She could offend anyone she wanted. Starks was surprised to learn that she used to be a vulnerable girl, a crybaby. But one day she suddenly grew a strange tail. The woman was surprised by it. The girl in the room recalled the day when she left with a backpack, saying goodbye and promising to return soon. But a voice stopped her. Raising her head, she was very frightened. It was her father, with a tracking device on his leg, stepping on the girl. With a bottle in his hand, he ordered her to come in and say that Daddy had returned. The girl was trembling all over with fear, but the man did not retreat. He pressed on her. He picked up the bottle, swung it at her, and shouted at her to go. Biting her lip, it hurt. She sat there without taking her hand off her chin. Dora cursed. Being here brings back bad memories for her. The woman stood up, leaned her hands on the table. It was time for them to go to university. The guy was being pulled by the blanket by a girl. She asked him to draw with her. The director laughed. "Hana is not indifferent to cute boys." Starks had to agree. He smiled. The guy liked being here. He drew with the kids as if they had nowhere to rush. Hana handed the album to Starks, smiled. She finished. Our hero was surprised. The drawing was beautiful. The guy praised it and drew attention to the wings of the butterfly. "She wanted wings like that," Starks recoiled. He looked shocked. He said that wings can scare people away and they won't want to be friends with you. She also liked dragonflies, so she leaned over the album and continued drawing. The teacher came in and warned that today was Hana's last day. Tomorrow she will live in another orphanage. She is a little sad, but she is ready. She handed the album into the guy's hands. It was a gift from her to him. It was nice. Walking along the corridor, the woman found out if Hana was ready for transportation. The girl was lying on the bed in only a nightgown, and there were people in suits around her. Continuing their conversation, the two women had been working for several years. On the wall, there were photographs of insect children. This time they sent a black giant centipede. The operation began. Taking a bottle of jungle juice in her hands, she commanded not to let go of the insect, even if it was disgusting. The centipede was placed on the girl's chest, and they began to splash. They had to be careful, otherwise they could lose their funding for a deformed product. There was a knock on the door. The women in suits knocked insistently and turned around. Starks appeared through the crack in the door, smiling and apologizing. Before he could ask, the door was slammed shut with a palm, sharply and without warning. The sweaty headmistress looked out. The guy was looking for the toilet and got lost. This seemed strange to the woman, because this is a forbidden level and the second floor. Starks grinned. He whispered that he knew about it and waited for the door to open. He kicked, the door flew off and hit the woman in the face. The director fell to the floor, another one ran up to her and began to find out if the guy had come in. He was already leaving, but he saw something in Hana's gifted album. Children don't lie. He showed the album to the women. There was a spray on it. Stark stood and accused the woman of lying. He recalled the conversation. His eyes glowed green, his wings fluttered. He always respected his elders, but only people, not parasites.